Jon Snow had never seen a day that promised less than the one he trudged through now. In the bitter wind roaring off the frosted peaks beyond Winterfell, his hair whipped around his face like black ribbons of despair. The morning sky bore the bruised color of approaching storms, yet the cold that settled in the marrow of his bones stirred something in him that felt more profound than mere temperature. He had known cold all his life, knew it in every stone of Winterfell, knew it from atop the Great Wall, but this chill seemed laced with omen. It stung, woke him, reminded him that the gods, the old gods, or perhaps the Seven, had plans larger than any mortal comprehended. He was traveling alone, which was a rarity these days. Night's Watch brothers usually rode in pairs or more, but Jon had insisted, and the few that remained at Castle Black, alongside the sparse northern allies left after the wars, had learned that once Jon Snow set his mind to something, there was little to be done to dissuade him. His heart bore the weight of duty. It always had. That sense of responsibility had pulled him away from the warm hall of Winterfell, away from Ghost, who paced anxiously at his side whenever Jon so much as walked from one tower to the next. But he wanted to leave Ghost behind for reasons he could not quite articulate. Perhaps he didn't want to risk the wolf's life on a mission that felt part madness, part blind, urgent necessity. Or perhaps something deeper tugged at him, an instinct older than memory that told him he had to make this journey alone. When he woke before dawn, he was drawn by a dream. A dragon's roar had echoed in his mind, the clarion call of some great, impossible creature across the star-swept sky. He had awakened, heart-pounding, the ghost of that roar vibrating through him, calling him out to the wild. Some would have dismissed it as a nightmare. Others might have seen it as an omen of doom. Jon Snow felt it for what it was, a summons. He still believed Daenerys Targaryen was across the sea, forging alliances in Essos to reclaim the Iron Throne, gathering forces and supporters from every corner of the land to kneel before her. The rumors were that she had hatched 3 dragons from petrified eggs, fulfilling what many believed was an extinct legacy. But news traveled slowly and changed in the telling. Jon had no intention of scouring the world in search of a rumored queen. He had enough to worry about in the north with White Walkers and the undead, but sometimes destiny took hold like an avalanche. Impossible to outrun, it swept him along without mercy. As he rode further from Winterfell, the chill deepened. Snow dusted the pines. Ice coated the bare branches like crystal ornaments in a bleak festival of solitude. He reined in his horse at the sight of battered trees torn as if by some monstrous creature. The gashes in the bark were as long as a man's arm, and Jon dismounted cautiously. Silence pressed in. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. Could giants be near? Could some monstrous beast roam these woods? Or perhaps it was the work of dire wolves in savage territorial battle. None of these explanations sat right. There was something methodical to the slashes, as if claws, not teeth, had done the damage. He knelt, inspecting the ground, and found burnt sap blackening the snow in a small, sticky patch. Burned as if by flame, though the surrounding pine needles were oddly intact. He spent the next several hours creeping through the forest, leading his horse rather than riding it, silent as only a trained ranger of the Watch could be. The tracks, if they could even be called that, led deeper into an area few humans frequented. He remembered fleeting stories old Nan had told, stories of dragons in the north, of hidden valleys where ancient Targaryens flew, beasts as black as night over desolate winterscapes. Myths, he had thought, or half-truths at best. Yet here, among these scorched and scarred trees, the possibility seemed more real. Something immense and powerful had been through here. Something that seemed to command fire. By late afternoon, a low ridge gave way to a rocky basin half buried under drifts of snow. Within that basin, steam rose from a partially frozen lake. Mist coiled around the gray boulders, swirling with each gust. At first, Jon thought the lake might be fed by a warm spring. Then he heard a faint rumble, so low it could have been the earth groaning beneath the ice. His heart thumped. Carefully, he tethered his horse to a tree and proceeded on foot, sword at his side, each footstep crunching in the powder. The sound alone felt painfully loud in this hush. Every nerve in his body tingled with caution. Parting the final ring of snowy firs, Jon saw what no living person in the north had witnessed for centuries, a dragon. It was coiled along the shoreline where ice met water, dark scales shimmering with a subtle coppery sheen against black. The beast was smaller than he imagined dragons could be, though still massive, easily 3 horses in length from head to tail, but something about its wiry frame and slender limbs suggested youth. Its wings, folded at its sides, looked ragged but not from age or sickness. More likely from a journey too long and harsh for its tender membranes to endure unscathed. The creature's head rested on its front claws. Tendrils of steam rose from its nostrils as though it exhaled heat even in slumber. Jon went still, heart pounding. The presence of such a being here seemed unthinkable. He briefly wondered if the White Walkers had conjured such a beast, or if some unknown sorcery had drawn the creature north. But the dragon's labored breathing told a simpler story of survival. It was wounded, or at least exhausted. A dark slash marred its flank, the edges of the scales cracked and bloodied. Possibly an injury inflicted by men who feared it, or from a brush with something else unnatural roaming these wilds. He knew he should turn back. He remembered the vow he had made. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. The vow that demanded he protect the realm from any threat, even if that threat was a single wounded dragon. But another thought raged within him, a sense of recognition. The dream's roar felt alive now, echoing in his skull. If the gods allowed him to find this creature, perhaps it was meant for a reason. The living might soon need the power of dragons. The war against the undead loomed like an oncoming tide, unstoppable without help. And if this beast was truly alone, separated from any Targaryen mother, who was left to guide it? He stepped forward, slowly. Though the dragon's eyes were closed, a flicker beneath the eyelids suggested it was aware. Dragons, from what he'd heard, were never wholly asleep. Each step Jon took felt as though he tread on the edge of a knife. One screech, one spurt of flame, and he would be ash on the snow. But he continued. Within a few strides he could smell the beast. A thick, acrid smell of scales, sulfur, and smoke. He cleared his throat softly, as if greeting a strange dog. The dragon's eyes shot open, blazing like golden suns. Its pupils narrowed, focusing on him instantly. Jon froze, hand near the hilt of his sword. Drawing the blade might be suicidal, but he had to be ready. The dragon lifted its head, nostrils flaring, and exhaled a short gust of heated air that blew back Jon's hair. His breath caught in his throat. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a frantic voice screamed to flee, but a deeper instinct took over, a calm acceptance. He found himself whispering, "Easy." It was the same tone he used with Ghost when the direwolf grew restless. Though foolish, the words spilled from his lips. The dragon shifted on its haunches, muscles flexing beneath the shimmering black scales. The gash on its flank oozed dark blood that steamed in the cold air. The creature looked at Jon, tilting its head, a swirl of foreign intelligence in its eyes. Perhaps it sensed no immediate threat from him, or perhaps it was too injured to fight. In any case, it did not incinerate Jon where he stood. Instead, it let out a low growl, a sound as deep as thunder. Jon raised his hands, palms outward, the universal gesture of no harm. He inched closer, eyes fixed on the dragon. Another wave of heat washed over him. The dragon's breath smelled of brimstone and raw meat. Jon's heart hammered so loudly, he feared it would aggravate the beast. Yet a strange wonder filled him, too. The awe of being in the presence of something legendary, something that should have died out centuries ago. He made it to within a few feet of the dragon's front claws and crouched, ignoring the screaming ache in his thighs. "You're hurt," he murmured, glancing at the gash. Blood trickled from beneath a cracked scale. He lowered his voice more. "Let me help." The dragon watched, unblinking. Jon removed his gloves carefully and reached a trembling hand toward the wound. The dragon hissed, bearing rows of dagger-like teeth. He froze, heart lurching. But still, he didn't flee. The next moments unwound in slow motion. His hand hovered an inch from the dark scale. Then it made contact. The dragon flinched, a ripple of muscle bracing itself for pain, but it did not lash out. Jon could feel the blazing warmth emanating from the scaled flesh, as though the dragon's blood boiled beneath the surface. Carefully, he examined the wound. No arrowhead or spear tip remained lodged inside, just a vicious tear that needed cleaning and bandaging. He whispered soothingly, even though the dragon could not understand his words. The hush of his tone seemed to matter more than the meaning. From his pack, Jon fetched a small pouch of herbs meant for disinfecting, a water skin, and some cloth. He poured water over the wound, washing away the worst of the blood. The dragon tensed, a low whine rumbling in its throat, but still did not attack. When Jon sprinkled the crushed herbs over the torn scales, a tiny wisp of smoke rose as the herbs met the intense heat of the dragon's hide. Jon's nerves jolted, but he remained steady, pressing cloth against the slash to stanch the bleeding. The dragon's breathing grew ragged. It shifted, wings rustling. Jon pressed gently, mindful not to cause unnecessary pain. When he finished, the dragon looked at him, the light of intelligence burning in its golden eyes. Their gazes locked. Jon felt a swirl of emotion that transcended mere reason. A bond, tenuous but potent, formed between them in that heartbeat. The animal recognized kindness, or at least recognized that Jon was not an enemy at this moment. The moment wavered as if the wind itself held its breath, waiting to see if peace would endure or if violence would erupt. Then, with a low rumble, the dragon lowered its head again, exhausted. Jon exhaled the breath he had been unconsciously holding. Their fragile truce seemed to hold, for now. The day fell into a rhythm of sorts. Jon moved slowly around the basin, gathering what meager kindling he could find. Though he guessed the dragon hardly needed a fire for warmth, he decided to stay the night. Leaving this creature wounded and alone in the wilds felt wrong, and he suspected if it flew off now, it might collapse midair. He built a small fire for himself and huddled near it, casting glances at the dragon. Occasionally, it lifted its great head to watch him, curiosity shining through the pain. The rest of the time, it lay half submerged in the watery edge of the lake, letting the water cool the throbbing wound. Night draped the forest in an unsettling quiet, broken only by the crackle of Jon's fire and the soft rustle of pine boughs. He ate the stale bread and dried meat he'd brought, offering the dragon a chunk of the latter by tossing it within reach. The beast sniffed it, let out a snort, and devoured it in one quick motion. The show of teeth made Jon's pulse jump, but the creature's acceptance of the food filled him with cautious relief. He lay back against a rock, cloak wrapped tight, and watched the swirl of stars appear overhead. The wonder of the day refused to let him slip easily into sleep. When his eyes did drift shut, nightmares of white walkers and whites prowled the edges of his mind, accompanied by a roaring black dragon. Each time he startled awake, he found the real dragon still lying there, a living contradiction in the silent north. Dawn broke in gentle colors of pale pink and silver. The dragon rose, stretching wings that glistened with frost. It flapped once experimentally, sending a spray of shimmering ice crystals into the air. Jon quickly stowed his gear and drew close again, examining the dragon's wound. The blood had crusted, and while it still looked painful, it no longer seeped fresh fluid. Jon pressed a hand to the dragon's neck, feeling the living furnace of its body. Softly, he said, "It'll take time, but you'll heal." The dragon blinked as if it recognized the reassurance. Carefully, Jon peeled away the soaked bandage and replaced it with a fresh one. Part of him expected the dragon to snap at him with lethal jaws. Instead, it remained still, though tension coiled in its frame. When Jon finished, the dragon shifted slightly, curling closer to him. The gesture was so surreal that Jon nearly laughed. A few days ago, he was in the warm hall of Winterfell, and now he crouched by a wounded dragon administering first aid. As the sun climbed higher, its feeble warmth melting some of the frost, Jon wondered what he should do next. He couldn't leave the dragon behind. If it lived, it might terrorize the north, though the people here were too scattered and war-torn to mount a proper defense. But he sensed that wasn't quite right. This dragon was alone, an orphan of a lineage rumored to be claimed by Daenerys Targaryen. If Daenerys truly was still in Essos gathering a following, the other dragons might be with her. Why was this one here, separated by an entire sea? It defied logic. But if it was here, then perhaps it had a role in the great war to come, the war against the undead. Jon thought of the prophecy of ice and fire, the legends whispered in the crypts beneath Winterfell. Maybe the realm needed more than one Targaryen champion. Or perhaps the old stories lied. He couldn't be sure. But he knew he felt an urgent drive to protect this dragon, to guide it back to health, to ensure that fire could stand against ice in the days of doom to come. He tried to coax the dragon to follow him, making soft clicking sounds, just as he would to a horse. It shifted, sniffing the ground where he walked, and let out a small whine. The savage intelligence in its eyes pierced Jon with a question: "Where do we go?" Jon pointed east, though it was a purely instinctive gesture. Maybe he would lead the dragon deeper into the mountainous wilds, somewhere remote where it could recover without threat of hunters or wildling raiders. He led his horse by the reins, watching the dragon pick itself up and follow, leaving deep-clawed prints in the snow. The scene was so absurd Jon almost doubted it was real. The three of them, horse, man, and dragon, moved slowly through the pine forest, branches brushing their heads, patches of snow falling in gentle lumps. The horse was understandably nervous, rolling its eyes and snorting. But perhaps it sensed the same tenuous truce. They traveled like this for hours, forging a path through the deeper wilderness. Occasionally, the dragon would pause to sniff at charred bark or scratch at frozen soil, but it made no sound, as though saving its strength. Jon cast frequent glances behind him, worried the beast might collapse or lose interest. Yet it trudged onward, quietly determined, wings half-furled at its sides. There were times Jon noticed it limping, favoring the side of its injured flank. He halted several times to let it rest and offered it more dried meat. This time, the dragon devoured the entire contents of Jon's ration pouch in a single gulp. Jon realized they needed proper food soon, perhaps deer or elk. He also realized that traveling with a dragon, even a smaller, injured one, could be extremely dangerous if it decided to hunt local wildlife. But for now he simply stayed close, guiding it with gentle gestures and words. On the third day they reached a sheltered valley that looked promising. A high ridge on one side, thick coniferous forest on the other, and a winding creek fed by a hidden hot spring. Steam rose from the water, swirling around mossy rocks. The place had a strange, serene beauty, an oasis of warmth in the frozen north. Jon tested the water and found it indeed warmer than the surrounding air, likely heated from deep below the earth. This might be the perfect spot for the dragon to rest and heal. He let the creature explore the edge of the creek. It waded in, hissing softly as the warm water caressed its wounded flank. Jon watched with a pang of relief. This environment might speed the healing process more than any bandages he could muster. He gathered wood to make a camp, built a small fire, then attempted to hunt, leaving the dragon behind under the watchful eye of his tethered horse. Jon found tracks of elk in the area and after a few hours managed to bring down a decent-sized doe with his bow. He hauled the carcass back, sweating despite the cold. He felt uneasy about leaving the dragon alone, but the fresh kill would be worth it. When he returned, the dragon lifted its head, nostrils quivering at the scent of blood. Jon dragged the carcass closer, then stepped back, allowing the beast to investigate. With a single tearing motion of its jaws, the dragon tore the flesh from bone. It feasted hungrily, devouring every piece with a violence that reminded Jon it was no tame creature. Yet it gave him no further trouble, glancing at him occasionally in a way that almost resembled gratitude. He shook his head at the absurd thought. Gratitude from a dragon? Days slid into a blurred routine of tending the dragon's wound, hunting, and maintaining a semblance of trust between them. If the dragon saw him as food or threat, it never acted on it. Sometimes it would rumble or hiss when he tightened the bandages, but the hostility never went beyond that. As the wound improved, the dragon's energy returned. Each morning, it stretched its wings more fully. Jon began to worry that once it felt strong enough, it would simply fly away and vanish. Part of him dreaded that day. Another part was terrified of what would happen if it stayed. In stolen moments, he practiced speaking in a soft, calm tone, calling the dragon Drogon in a quiet voice. He had no true knowledge if this was the same beast from the rumors, the famed black dragon of Daenerys Targaryen. But the stories said the largest and blackest of her dragons was named Drogon, after her late husband Khal Drogo. And though this dragon wasn't massive by any means, perhaps still growing, Jon felt in his bones that this might indeed be Drogon, separated from Daenerys by some twist of fate. If so, destiny had a strange sense of humor. On a frosty morning, Jon awoke to see Drogon perched on the largest rock by the creek, wings extended as if to catch the pale sunlight. He looked regal, a living piece of the ancient world, scaled and black that shimmered with undertones of red. For a moment, Jon just stared, feeling the weight of wonder in his chest. The scene was quietly triumphant. Then Drogon turned his head, regarded Jon with those luminous eyes, and let out a soft purring sound. Jon approached, heart thumping. He had a raw chunk of venison in hand from the previous day's kill. He offered it to the dragon on an outstretched palm. Drogon dipped his head, jaws parted, and gently plucked the meat from Jon's hand. The wave of heat from the dragon's breath was intense. Jon let out a shaky exhale. The trust between them was unthinkable. Yet here they stood, man and dragon, forging a bond once believed extinct in Westeros. Days turned into a week, then two. The secluded valley felt strangely like home. The winter storms that battered the surrounding forests rarely intruded here. Jon's hunts grew easier as he learned the game trails. Drogon's wound sealed and the scarred scales took on a healthy gleam. The dragon's appetite expanded, forcing Jon to hunt almost daily for large prey. At times, Drogon would join the hunt, leaping into the air for short bursts of flight, terrorizing a herd of elk so Jon could pick off the stragglers. It took coordination, but each time they succeeded, Jon marveled at the synergy. He was forging a partnership that, in all of history, was rumored to be the unique privilege of Targaryens. Jon was no Targaryen, or so he had believed his entire life. He was Eddard Stark's bastard, raised in the frigid halls of Winterfell, overshadowed by his legitimate siblings. Yet once or twice, Jon felt a bizarre stirring in his blood as he watched Drogon soar overhead. It was a feeling beyond exhilaration, like old, half-forgotten instincts awakening, urging him to ride, to conquer the skies. Nonsense, he told himself. He was of the north, not of Dragonspawn. And yet his closeness to Drogon felt like the quiet hum of an ancestral chord. He tried to ignore it. The realm had enough trouble. If the stories about White Walkers were true, if the dead truly marched, then this bond with a dragon might be all that stood between life and annihilation. He didn't have the luxury to ponder genealogical mysteries. He had to prepare. When the third week dawned, Drogon's flight grew more confident. Each day, the dragon tested his wings, soaring above the valley, roaring at the horizon. Jon felt pride and trepidation. Perhaps it was time to return to civilization to reveal what he had discovered. Could he bring a dragon to Winterfell, or to Castle Black, without causing panic? The North was suspicious of anything southern, let alone a monstrous reptile from Targaryen lore. But an even more pressing question loomed. How would Daenerys Targaryen react if she learned her dragon was in the hands of a self-proclaimed bastard in the North? If this truly was her Drogon, then Jon had unknowingly placed himself at odds with the would-be queen of Westeros. Or perhaps he would be forging an alliance. The possibilities churned in his mind. Yet time was running short. Reports of White Walker sightings had been filtering south. Wildlings who migrated beyond the wall whispered of entire villages lost to the Whites. Word of scattered battles reached Jon's ears during brief encounters with northern hunters. The undead army was on the move. Winter was here in full force, and so was the threat of an endless night. Jon could no longer remain hidden in a peaceful valley, nursing a dragon back to health in blissful isolation. Duty demanded he make a choice. So one morning he made the decision. He gathered his belongings, strapped on his sword, and approached Drogon. The dragon regarded him, tilting its head as if sensing Jon's resolve. Jon murmured, "It's time we face the world." He moved toward Drogon's flank, heart hammering. The memory of Daenerys riding dragons in rumor, in stories told by travelers, flashed through his mind. The Targaryens were said to be the only family able to ride dragons safely, though even they faced dangers. Yet the image of Aegon the Conqueror soared in his thoughts, leading a new age. "I'm no conqueror," Jon whispered, "but I've got to try." Tentatively, he placed a hand on Drogon's side, where the scales were thickest, and pressed. The dragon made a low rumbling sound, not hostile, almost encouraging. Jon's boots slipped a bit on the smooth scales. He found a foothold near the back ridge, muscle coiling beneath him, summoning a courage beyond rational thought. He hoisted himself up and swung a leg over the broad base of the dragon's neck. Felt utterly insane. He had no saddle, no reins, nothing. Just scales that radiated scorching heat and a dragon's powerful form beneath him, tense with potential energy. Drogon shifted, let out a muffled snort, and raised his head. Jon clutched at the spikes that ran along the dragon's spine, praying he wouldn't tumble off. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest rustled in a soft breeze. Jon's horse, grazing nearby, lifted its head in mild alarm. Then Drogon spread his wings, each membrane stretching to its full glorious expanse. A beat of those colossal wings kicked up snow in a swirling tempest. With a single tremendous bound, Drogon vaulted into the air, sending Jon's stomach lurching into his throat. He clung desperately to the scaled ridges, eyes shut against the rush of wind and fear. Higher and higher they ascended, the valley falling away beneath them like a dream. Jon forced his eyes open, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The treetops became a blur, the snowy ridges a pattern of white and gray far below. Drogon's body moved with a sinuous grace, each powerful wing beat propelling them through icy clouds. The air was frigid at this altitude, but the dragon's body radiated warmth that kept Jon from succumbing to the cold. It was like being caught between two worlds, the chill of the open sky and the heat of living fire. He could do nothing but cling, breathless, as Drogon soared across the northern wilderness. They landed with surprising gentleness in a wide clearing near the edge of a rocky escarpment. Jon slid off, knees shaking. He knelt in the snow, trying to steady his pounding heart. Drogon regarded him with a bright, keen stare, as if to say, "See what we can do." Jon found himself smiling, a rare moment of unguarded joy. He had flown, truly flown, in the belly of the winter sky on the back of a living dragon, and he was still alive to marvel at it. That flight changed everything. Jon recognized the potential advantage of being able to travel swiftly, to scout from the air, even to unleash dragonfire if the undead threatened. He felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced since learning of the White Walkers. Perhaps the realm wasn't doomed. Perhaps with Drogon's help, and maybe eventually, if it came to it, the help of Daenerys Targaryen's other dragons, if they existed, there was a chance to stand against the darkness. They had to unify the living. But first, he had to reveal himself and Drogon to allies who would not try to kill them on sight. With that in mind, Jon coaxed Drogon into a series of short flights over the next several days, each one pushing the boundaries of their connection. Jon learned to anticipate the dragon's shifts and wing beats, leaning into turns, gripping the ridges tightly when Drogon dove or ascended. They soared over frozen lakes, stony ridges, and silent valleys where the winter wolves prowled. On one such flight, they caught sight of wildling scouts prowling near the base of a mountain. The sight reminded Jon of his duty. The free folk were vulnerable, too. If the White Walkers got them, they would only swell the undead army. Jon decided it was time to head back to Winterfell, or near it at least, to inform his family or those who remained. Though he was no longer a sworn brother of the Watch in the most official sense, death and resurrection had complicated that vow. He still bore the responsibility of protecting the realm. And the Starks, the only family he had ever known, should learn of this extraordinary development. Drogon's existence could tip the balance in the war to come. The journey south was a series of bold leaps. Jon couldn't simply march a dragon down the King's Road. He relied on Drogon's flight, traveling mostly by night to avoid panicked villagers, landing in secluded clearings where Jon would hunt or rest. The bond between them grew stronger with each trek across the sky. At times, Drogon soared so high Jon found it difficult to breathe. The cold was razor-sharp, but the adrenaline and the dragon's body heat kept him going. Whenever they landed, Jon's muscles shook from the exertion, but a fierce determination lit his eyes. They were making progress. He was bringing a dragon to the north to rally the living. It sounded like madness even to him. But he pressed on. One midnight, they soared over an expanse of dark pine forest. The moon glowed faintly behind clouds. Far below, flickers of torchlight revealed an encampment, men on the move. Jon squinted, leaning forward, trying to discern their banners. He signaled Drogon to descend for a closer look. As they dipped lower, the torches bobbed in sudden agitation. The men below must have heard the rush of wings. Jon's eyes widened as he recognized the sigils, the flayed man of House Bolton. A twist of fury coiled in his chest. The Boltons had betrayed the Starks, taken Winterfell, and committed atrocities. Roose Bolton was dead now, but Ramsay's legacy of brutality lingered. These men might be remnants of that vile regime, still prowling the north. A braver man might have unleashed dragonfire then and there. But Jon reined in the impulse. He had no illusions about the destructive power of a dragon. The living couldn't afford to kill each other while the undead threat loomed. Still, he made a mental note of their location and forced Drogon to circle away. Perhaps once he united the living in a common cause, these rogues would be dealt with properly. The temptation to strike now gnawed at him, but wisdom stayed his hand. They continued south under cover of night, eventually crossing the icy waters of the White Knife River. When at last Winterfell's ramparts rose on the horizon, its towers stark against the night sky, Jon felt a swirl of emotions. He had left this place as a child, returned as a brother of the Night's Watch, died, been reborn, and now arrived astride a dragon. His life had taken turns no man could have predicted. He guided Drogon to land in a clearing a safe distance from the castle walls near a small copse of oak and ash. Snow drifted in silent drifts and the lights of Winterfell glowed softly, an oasis of warmth in the night. Jon dismounted, legs trembling from hours of flight. He whispered to Drogon, "Stay here. Stay hidden." He didn't know how much the dragon understood, but Drogon folded his wings, settling with a huff among the trees. Jon gently touched the scaled neck as if to convey trust. He took a moment to gather his courage, then trudged through the snow toward the castle gates. Guards hailed him as he approached, crossbows leveled. Recognition dawned when the torchlight illuminated his face. "My lord," one guard stammered. We weren't expecting you." He had to repeat that he was indeed Jon Snow, that yes, he lived, and that he needed to speak to whomever was in charge now. The guard nodded fearfully, sending a runner. Word soon spread through the courtyard that Jon Snow had returned. Heads turned as he walked by, curious, astonished. Some whispered his name in awe, remembering the rumors that he had died and come back. Others stood uncertain. His face was grim, determined, and half-frozen from the flight. He crossed the courtyard, stepping over muddy slush, until the great doors of the main hall opened to reveal a swirl of heat and conversation. He was ushered in, and there, by the hearth, stood Sansa Stark. His half-sister, no, his cousin, though that secret remained mostly unknown, looked at him with a mixture of relief and worry. Her red hair glowed in the firelight, her posture regal. "Jon," she breathed, stepping forward to embrace him. He allowed himself the brief comfort of her warmth, but quickly drew back. There was too much to discuss. Around them, lords and ladies of the north turned curious gazes, the sense of tension palpable. Sansa guided him to the high table where a seat was hastily prepared. Hot wine was offered. He drank, letting the warmth fight off the chill in his bones. He saw familiar faces, Davos Seaworth, loyal as always, and Brienne of Tarth, watchful and stern. Tormund Giantsbane was absent, likely beyond the wall, rallying the free folk. So many changes since he'd been here last. He began to speak, his voice low, carrying the weight of everything he had seen. He told them of the signs of White Walkers, of villages gone silent, of the undead creeping ever southward. He warned them that the time for unity was now or never. But as he spoke, he withheld the dragon's existence, uncertain how to break such news. The tension in the hall mounted, but the northern lords seemed resolute. They had gathered at Winterfell precisely because the threat was dire. Glover, Manderley, Serwyn, they were all in attendance or had sent emissaries. Even Lyanna Mormont's fierce stare was absent, but her sworn men were there, full of the Bear Island's fighting spirit. Sansa nodded, her expression grim but steadfast. She believed him. She had learned enough harsh truths not to doubt the existence of nightmares. Afterwards, in a more private setting near the hearth, Jon found a moment alone with Sansa. She asked him quietly, "What else have you discovered?" She knew him well enough to sense a secret withheld. Her keen eyes searched his. Jon swallowed. This was the moment. He explained haltingly, carefully, that a dragon had been found in the north, injured, near death, and that he had aided its recovery. Sansa's eyes widened, disbelieving at first. Then, seeing the grave certainty in Jon's face, she placed a trembling hand over her mouth. "A dragon?" she repeated. "I thought only Daenerys Targaryen had dragons. How did it come here?" Jon shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know it's real, and it's alive, and I've bonded with it somehow. It listens to me, or tolerates me, at least." The enormity of his confession weighed heavily in the room. The dancing flames of the hearth seemed to hold their breath. "Sansa, this could change everything. If we have a dragon on our side, we might stand a chance against the Night King." She exhaled, the color draining from her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it changes everything. But how will the lords react? They're already wary of foreigners, and a dragon is monstrous to them. Many still curse the Targaryens for the past. Yet we must find a way to unite them." She squeezed Jon's hand. "Where is it now?" "Outside the walls, in the forest," he said quietly. "I couldn't bring it to the courtyard without chaos breaking loose." They spoke late into the night, weighing the risks and rewards. Sansa agreed that revealing the dragon was inevitable, but they had to choose the right moment, perhaps in front of the gathered lords. They had to show that the beast wasn't an enemy, that it was a living weapon to defend the north against the undead. And perhaps, with time, they might even form an alliance with Daenerys Targaryen. Jon hesitated at that last point. If Daenerys demanded the return of her dragon, would Jon relinquish it? The mere thought of parting from Drogon now felt oddly heartbreaking. But the realm's safety came first. Personal feelings had no place in a war for survival. The next day dawned crisp and cold, with pale sunlight shining over Winterfell's walls. They arranged a meeting in the courtyard at midday, summoning the lords and key retainers. Sansa stood on the steps with Brienne at her side, her bearing calm and regal. Jon was absent from that initial gathering, presumably off handling some secret task. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd. Davos cast worried glances at Sansa, who gave a reassuring nod. When the moment came, Sansa signaled and the gates were opened. A few heartbeats of tense silence passed. Then, with a rush of wind that drew gasps from every throat, Drogon soared over the outer walls, black wings outstretched, shimmering in the winter sun. The courtyard erupted in shouts of alarm as men scrambled, some instinctively reaching for weapons. Sansa raised her hands, shouting for calm. Drogon swooped low, the gust of his wings blowing snow into swirling clouds. And there, astride the dragon's neck, was Jon Snow, cloak billowing behind him. He guided Drogon with no saddle, no reins, only a tenuous grip on the dragon's ridges and a fierce determination in his eyes. Never had the North seen such a sight in living memory. The last time dragons flew above Winterfell, it had been the age of Aegon and his sisters, legends older than the oldest living man could recall. The shock was palpable. Some men fell to their knees. Others stood, gaping. The flight lasted mere moments, but it might as well have been an eternity of awe. Drogon circled once over the courtyard, then landed with surprising care, snow crunching beneath its claws. A hush so absolute fell that even the whimpers of frightened horses were muted. Soldiers looked ready to flee or fight, but Sansa cried, "Hold. Do not attack." Her voice cracked like a whip. "He is with us." Jon dismounted, legs stiff. He placed a hand on Drogon's side, turning to face the crowd. His breath misted in the cold air, but he stood firm. Then, as if sensing Jon's desire, Drogon lowered his head in a manner akin to a subdued beast. The stunned silence grew heavier. Jon's voice rose, calm but carrying authority. "This is Drogon," he said, the simple statement echoing off stone walls. "He was wounded in the north. I found him, helped him heal. Now he fights for us. The enemy we face beyond the wall, the White Walkers, is unlike any foe we've ever known. We must unite, or we will fall." His gaze swept the courtyard, taking in the sea of astonished faces. "I won't pretend a dragon in the north is anything less than extraordinary. But we are living in extraordinary times. If we do not stand together, the dawn will never come." Silence followed, deep as a crypt. Then, slowly, Davos stepped forward. He bowed his head toward Jon, then turned to the crowd. "I've seen the dead walk. I've seen worse. If a dragon can help us, then by the gods, we ought to take whatever help we can get." His rough accent carried a note of pleading and command. One by one, the lords exchanged glances, weighing fear against necessity. Sansa looked out over them, regal and poised, her expression urging them to choose unity. Finally, Lord Glover, his jaw clenched, gave a stiff nod. "I'd rather see a Targaryen beast help us than see my halls overrun by dead men." Others nodded, albeit uncertainly. Thus, a fragile acceptance began to form. Men lowered their weapons, though many still eyed the dragon with terror. Jon gently stroked Drogon's scales, murmuring quiet words of reassurance. For a moment, the courtyard felt the presence of old magic stirring in the cold northern air. A living dragon forging a bond with a man they'd once called a bastard. It was a moment that would be recounted in hushed voices for generations to come. Over the following days, Winterfell buzzed with the news. Word spread across the north like wildfire. Some believed it a miracle, others an omen of doom. But in Winterfell itself, the lords and their retinues could not deny the reality of Drogon's presence. Jon took pains to keep the dragon outside the castle walls, letting it hunt in the surrounding forests. Occasionally, they'd perform short flights so the soldiers grew accustomed to the sight. Many were still uneasy, but no one dared approach Drogon uninvited. Sansa strategized with Jon, urging him to send ravens to the remaining northern houses. Some houses, like the Karstarks, had newly bent the knee to House Stark. Others, like the Umbers, faced internal struggles. But each had to be brought into the fold. The White Walkers threatened every living soul, no matter their old loyalties or grudges. A fortnight later, delegates from distant corners of the north began arriving, trudging through the snow to witness the rumored dragon. Lyanna Mormont came in person, a fierce determination in her youthful eyes. She demanded to see the creature, to confirm with her own gaze that the legends were true. Jon obliged, standing beside Drogon in a clearing beyond the walls while the small but formidable lady of Bear Island stared up at the beast. She said nothing for a long moment, simply studying the dragon's black scales, the steam rising from its nostrils in the cold air. Then she turned her sharp gaze on Jon. "If you say it will help us kill the undead, I believe you," she said, her voice clear. "But it had better breathe fire true when the time comes." Jon met her eyes, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "It will." These alliances began to coalesce, forming a ragged but determined coalition of northern forces. And through it all, Drogon remained a looming symbol of hope and terror. The castle guards spoke in hushed tones of how sometimes at night the dragon's roar echoed across the ramparts as if challenging the darkness itself. Tormund Giantsbane, returning from beyond the wall, nearly fell off his horse when he first saw Drogon perched on a parapet, wings partially folded. His reaction was a booming laugh, followed by a muttered thanks that the beast was on their side. He slapped Jon's shoulder. "You always did have a knack for madness, Snow." Despite the progress, the threat of the White Walkers drew ever closer. Scouts reported sightings of whites in the nearby forests. Tormund warned that Har Home had been nearly overrun. Skeletons of villages dotted the landscape. Sansa rallied the castle's defenses. The blacksmiths labored day and night, forging dragonglass weapons from the supply Jon had arranged to retrieve from Dragonstone's mines after hearing rumors of its abundance. The outer walls were reinforced with sharpened stakes and cunning traps. Every capable man and woman was trained to fight. Fear pressed in on all sides. At last, the day arrived when the White Walkers marched on Winterfell. A deathly cold preceded them, a bitter chill that made the air crackle with hoarfrost. Scouts raced back with warnings, their horses foam-flecked and trembling. The lords mustered their armies in the field beyond Winterfell. Bonfires were lit, archers lined the battlements, and catapults were loaded with containers of oil and dragonglass shards. Jon stood at the forefront, clad in black armor with the Stark sigil on his cloak, Ghost by his side, and Drogon looming in the sky overhead. Thunder rumbled in the distance, or perhaps it was the sound of countless wights shuffling forward. The first wave of undead emerged from the tree-line, a twisted sea of rotting flesh and hollow eyes. Fear clutched every heart, but the northern armies held formation. Tormund bellowed a war cry, brandishing a dragonglass axe. Lyanna Mormont stood tall beside her men, refusing to cower. Sansa watched from the battlements, face pale but resolute. In the distance, a mounted figure in icy armor rode among the ranks of the dead, the Night King. Jon felt a chill deeper than mere temperature. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. He exchanged a glance with Davos, who nodded grimly. "Light the trenches," Jon commanded. Torches were flung onto the wooden stakes soaked in oil. Fire roared to life, creating a ring of flame around Winterfell's outer perimeter. The whites shrank back momentarily, screeching in eerie unison. Then, in a wave of unstoppable horror, they swarmed forward, heedless of the flames, toppling into them to create bridges of their burning bodies. Jon gritted his teeth. "Drogon," he shouted, though he knew the dragon might not need the verbal cue. A roar split the sky as Drogon descended in a rush of black scales and beating wings. Flames erupted from his jaws, a pillar of fire scorching the front lines of the undead. The night lit up like day, the shrieks of incinerated whites filling the air. Cheers rose from the northern ranks. Hope surged. As the battle raged, the living fought with everything they had. Dragonglass-tipped arrows rained death on the whites. Swords of Valyrian steel clashed with the chilling blades of White Walkers. The sound of steel and bone rang out. Screams tore the night. Jon moved like a shadow, Ghost at his side, slicing through whites with practiced efficiency. A White Walker advanced on him, frost crackling around its tall form, but Jon parried its blow with long claw, the Valyrian steel singing with lethal harmony. He thrust forward, the blade biting deep into the walker's chest. It shattered into icy fragments, and Jon dashed onward. Above, Drogon rained fire on masses of whites, turning them to ash and blazing arcs. But the Night King watched, pale and implacable. He raised a hand. From behind the ranks of the undead, a monstrous shape lurched forward, a giant white, lumbering and unstoppable. Then, to Jon's horror, more shapes appeared, ice spiders big as hounds from legend. They scuttled over bodies, their mandibles clicking. The tide of death felt endless. For every wave Drogon incinerated, more whites took their place. The living were pushed back toward Winterfell's walls. Jon scanned the battlefield, searching for the Night King. He spotted that terrible figure on a rise, flanked by White Walkers. The dead parted like water for him, and with cold confidence he stooped to raise fresh corpses. With a sickening lurch, men who had fallen moments ago staggered back to their feet, eyes glazed, and joined the undead ranks. The living forces faltered, despair creeping in. They had known the Night King could do this, but witnessing it in real time shattered morale. But Jon Snow refused to yield. He roared, "Fall back to the second perimeter." The armies retreated in ragged order behind another set of spikes and trenches. The plan was to funnel the dead into kill zones where Drogon's fire and the archers' volley could do the most damage. Sansa, from the battlements, directed the archers to loose wave after wave of arrows. The sky was thick with their burning shafts. Still, the dead surged. Jon knew they had to strike at the Night King himself. Cut off the head and the snake would die. Yet the Night King was well protected, flanked by dozens of White Walkers. Jon clenched his jaw. There was a chance. If he could reach the Night King on Drogon's back, maybe, just maybe, he could finish this. His gaze flicked to Drogon, who torched a group of Whites near the southern flank. The dragon soared overhead, searching for the next cluster to incinerate. Jon lifted Longclaw high, letting the firelight reflect off the blade. Drogon roared in recognition, circling down. Jon leaped onto Drogon as the dragon's claws tore into the earth, sending up snow and dirt. He clambered onto the scaly back, breath ragged. There, he whispered, pointing his sword at the distant rise where the Night King stood. Take me to him. The moment was electric. Drogon's muscles bunched, wings spreading wide. In a blast of wind and fury, they launched into the sky. A few of the living saw and cheered, rallying around the symbolic charge. Jon clung to Drogon's ridges, heart hammering like a drum. The swirl of the battlefield lay below, a chaotic dance of living and dead. He set his sights on the Night King. As Drogon dove, the Night King turned his icy gaze upward, lifting a spear of ice crafted with impossible precision. Jon's gut twisted, recalling how a single spear from the Night King had felled Viserion in rumor. But this time, Drogon was prepared. He banked sharply, evading the spear that hurtled past with lethal speed, shattering against a distant boulder. Fire streamed from Drogon's jaws, aimed at the Night King. The flames struck the area around him, incinerating Whites and scorching the ground. For a heartbeat, the Night King was obscured by searing fire. Jon felt a flare of hope. Then the flames parted, revealing the Night King untouched. Cold fury emanated from his pallid face. He raised another lance of ice, ready to throw. Jon urged Drogon to dive lower, swooping behind a cluster of undead giants, using them as partial cover. The Night King hurled the lance, and though Drogon twisted away, the spear grazed his flank, slicing through scales. Drogon roared in pain, faltering mid-flight. Jon's heart seized. He pressed a hand to the wounded scales, feeling the dragon's blood sear his fingers. Hold on, Jon muttered. Just hold on. Drogon steadied, flapping powerfully despite the injury. They circled, trying to find a vulnerable angle. Below them, the living were still locked in a desperate struggle. The White Walkers advanced, lethal in their frosty armor. Jon knew time was running out. They had to break the undead tide by killing the Night King, or all would be lost. Stealing his resolve, he guided Drogon into a headlong plunge. This time, the Night King stood waiting, eyes glittering like frozen stars. A swirl of icy wind churned around him as if he summoned a storm. Jon readied Longclaw. The plan was insane, but desperation left no choice. If he could leap from Drogon's back and strike the Night King with the Valyrian steel, it might shatter him as it did other walkers. At the last second, Jon shouted, "Now!" Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame directly at the Night King. Simultaneously, Jon leaped from the dragon's back, propelled by momentum. The swirling inferno momentarily blinded him to everything but searing light. But he trusted the plan. He tucked into a roll, bracing for impact. He felt the shock of landing on icy ground, a jarring pain in his shoulder. He rolled to a crouch, Longclaw clenched in white-knuckled grip. The flames cleared, and there he stood, face to face with the Night King. The ancient horror loomed tall, frost-limbing his armor. Shards of ice jutted from his gauntlets. His blue eyes bored into Jon with an otherworldly malevolence. A whisper of chilling wind raked across the battlefield. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the Night King drew his own blade of crystalline ice and advanced with chilling grace. Jon swung Longclaw in a fierce arc, aiming for the Night King's torso. The Night King parried effortlessly, the clash of Valyrian steel on enchanted ice resonating with a sharp crack. It felt like smashing metal against stone. Sparks flew. The force rattled Jon's arms. He pressed forward, fueled by desperation. Each blow was parried or dodged with uncanny speed. The Night King's strength was supernatural, but Jon's skill and resolve were honed by countless battles. He evaded a thrust, pivoting to deliver a powerful slash. Sparks showered as Longclaw connected with the Night King's blade, nearly knocking it aside. Suddenly, the Night King flicked his wrist, sending a wave of intense cold. Jon gasped, stumbling back as frost clutched his limbs. The ground beneath him froze, slick with ice. He lost his footing, toppling backward. The Night King stood over him, blade raised. Jon's heart pounded. He twisted, ignoring the pain in his shoulder, and swung Longclaw upward in a desperate counter. The blades met. A high-pitched shriek cut the air, as if the steel itself cried out. Then, in a burst of fury, Drogon slammed into the ground behind the Night King, wings outstretched. The impact shook the earth, sending the Night King staggering. Jon seized the moment, rolling away. He leaped to his feet and lunged, Longclaw aimed at the Night King's exposed back. The Night King twisted, but not quickly enough to avoid the blow. Valyrian steel tore through icy armor, plunging into the ancient being's core. A piercing wail erupted, echoing across the battlefield. Tom seemed to freeze. The Night King's body cracked, lines of blue-white light spiderwebbing across his form. Jon met those inhuman eyes, seeing shock or something akin to it. Then, in a burst of icy shards, the Night King shattered. A shockwave of cold billowed outward, cutting through the undead ranks. Whites collapsed like puppets with severed strings. White walkers crumbled into shards of ice. Giants toppled, spiders froze mid-motion, all of them disintegrating in a chain reaction. The entire undead horde collapsed in an instant of miraculous finality. Silence fell, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living. They stood, weapons raised, expecting more. But the whites were truly gone, reduced to dust and fragments. A stunned cry went up, followed by cheers that grew into a thunderous roar. The living had triumphed. The Great War, at least on this field, was over. People embraced one another, tears of relief streaming down grimy faces. Jon stood amidst the wreckage, chest heaving. He stared at the spot where the Night King had stood, ice crystals melting on the ground. A wave of exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. Then Drogon nudged him gently with a massive head, as if checking if he was alive. Jon pressed a hand to the warm scales, tears burning in his eyes. They had done it. Together, man and dragon had slain the embodiment of death. The magnitude of it settled on his shoulders, mixed with profound grief for those lost in the battle. In the aftermath, Winterfell's courtyard filled with survivors. Many were injured, some grievously. Pyres were built for the dead. Among the living, a fierce sense of camaraderie prevailed. They had faced the darkness and won. Sansa found Jon, hugging him fiercely, relief shining in her tear-brimmed eyes. Davos clasped Jon's shoulder with something like reverence. Even Tormund, battered and bruised, roared with laughter and glee, calling Jon the craziest crow he'd ever seen. Above them, Drogon soared once more, letting out a triumphant roar that reverberated across the ruined battlefield. The echoes of that roar reached far, carrying the news of the Night King's downfall. The living had survived the long night, in part thanks to a bastard from the north who had found a wounded dragon and refused to let it die. Whispers would spread across the land of a new legend, how Jon Snow and Drogon had become a force that broke the tide of the undead. And though kings and queens would later vie for thrones and crowns and the realm would struggle to rebuild, the memory of that night when fire stood against ice and won would become myth. Weeks later, as the snows began to abate and the first timid signs of spring touched the north, Jon gazed over the battlements of Winterfell. He could see Drogon perched near the broken outer walls, sunlight glancing off scales that were nearly healed from the Night King's spear. Once, Jon had feared the beast might leave. But Drogon remained, at least for now, a living reminder of the bond they shared. Rumors flew that Daenerys Targaryen was making her way west with an army drawn by the news of the Night King's defeat and the presence of her dragon in the north. How that meeting would unfold, no one could say. But Jon found himself strangely calm. The realm had faced its greatest threat and survived. Whatever came next would be handled. They had a chance for a future now. Night came, and Jon walked the quiet courtyard, the flicker of torches illuminating shadows. Stopping at the spot where Drogon's massive footprints had once crushed the snow, he reflected on the improbable journey that had led him here. The frightened bastard boy who had yearned for acceptance in a lord's hall was now a hero of the north, a slayer of the Night King, a rider of dragons. Fate was a cruel and wondrous weaver. Perhaps he was no mere bastard after all, but the rightful child of ice and fire. A hush settled around him as he considered the possibility that the blood of dragons might run in his veins. It was a question for another day. He made his way to the godwood. The heart tree stood silent in the moonlight, red leaves rustling softly. Kneeling before it, Jon closed his eyes. He thought of Ned Stark, of all who had fallen, of the great unknown lying ahead. He whispered a prayer of gratitude for the living, for the chance to build a better world. The wind carried his words through the ancient branches. When he opened his eyes, he imagined the carved face on the weirwood looked slightly gentler. Rising, he felt a surge of determination. The wars of men might still rage, but winter no longer threatened to last forever. Tomorrow, he would meet with Sansa and the other lords to plan the rebuilding of the north. Perhaps soon, he would meet Daenerys, mother of dragons, and decide the fate of Drogon's allegiance. But for tonight, Jon Snow stood in the quiet hush of the godwood, a new warmth stirring in the winter air. He was no longer just the watcher on the wall. He was the keeper of a dragon's trust, and for the first time in his life, he felt a glimmer of destiny's call. The moon hung high, casting silver patterns on the snow. Through the open arches of Winterfell's courtyard, Jon glimpsed Drogon, resting in the calm night. A wave of something like affection spread through him. He recalled the day they first met, the terror and awe, the slow forging of a bond. He thought of Ghost, who had settled in more easily than he ever expected, prowling at a safe distance from the dragon but gradually growing accustomed to its presence. Somehow it all fit: the direwolf, the dragon, and the man who straddled the line between them. Morning light found Jon on the battlements, still lost in thought, arms resting on the cold stone. Pale beams touched the land, revealing distant forests, rolling hills, and the hush of a realm wounded but alive. Behind him, footsteps approached. Sansa joined him, her cloak fluttering in the early breeze. She did not speak immediately, simply looking out over the land they had saved, battered though it was. At length, she said quietly, "We can rebuild, Jon. We can make the North strong again. With or without a dragon queen." Jon nodded, lips curving in a tired half-smile. "Yes," he murmured. "We will. We'll make a future worth living in." He glanced toward Drogon, perched in the near distance, the sunrise glinting on black scales like living coal. "And we won't stand alone." They stood together in companionable silence, siblings by blood or bond, it mattered little now. Survivors of the long night. Bearers of new hope. A gentle wind rustled Sansa's hair, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant memory of winter roses. Jon felt the warmth of the rising sun on his face, and for a moment he closed his eyes, letting the light wash away the lingering shadows of death. The story was far from over. But they had turned a page in the annals of Westeros, and Jon Snow, once a nameless bastard, had proven that even the coldest winter could be thawed by the flames of a single dragon's heart, and by the unyielding courage of a man who refused to surrender to darkness. Jon woke in the gray half-light before dawn, his breath steaming in the cold air of the bedchamber. Though safe behind Winterfell's walls, he still slept restlessly, haunted by dreams where the sky burned with dragon fire or turned black with the wings of undead ravens. He couldn't recall the details of those dreams upon waking, but they left him unsettled. It had been weeks since the victory over the Night King, yet the ghost of that battle lingered in everyone's eyes. Winterfell's courtyard, once so full of tension and terror, had eased into an uneasy calm. Outside, the snowdrifts no longer seemed so high. If one listened closely enough, one might hear the faint drip of melting icicles. Still, winter did not relinquish its hold easily. He rose, dressed in simple black breeches and a thick wool tunic, and laced his boots with a quiet determination. The moment he opened the chamber door, he was greeted by a swirl of cold air that made him pull his cloak tighter. Out his shoulders. At his feet, Ghost looked up, eyes gleaming red, ever watchful. The dire wolf had taken to lingering outside Jon's door, as if worried that, at any moment, Jon might vanish again as he had once done in the bitter night with no warning. Jon ran his hand along Ghost's thick white fur and murmured a soft greeting. Together, they descended the dim corridors toward the great hall. The castle was stirring to life. Servants hurried by with baskets of bread, sacks of grain, steaming kettles of watered wine. Some cast curious glances, still caught between respect and awe. To them, Jon Snow had become a figure half-rooted in legend, the bastard of Winterfell who had returned from death, found a dragon in the wild, slain the Night King. It was an epithet that weighed heavily on him, though he tried not to show it. A man was a man, after all, shaped by fate and circumstance. He did not feel mythical. He entered the great hall where the early risers were already at breakfast. Sansa sat at the high table reviewing a small ledger with a furrowed brow. When she noticed Jon, she put it aside and waved him over. Steam rose from bowls of porridge and the smell of warm bread lingered in the air. The battered banners of the direwolf still hung from the rafters, signifying the resurrection of House Stark's stronghold. Jon approached, and Sansa's lips curved in a faint smile. She looked stronger these days, more certain of herself. The war had cost her too, but it had also proven her resilience. He took a seat across from her. A servant poured him a cup of hot tea, brewed from local herbs. Sansa spoke quietly so as not to be overheard. "How did you sleep?" she asked, her tone gentle. She always asked him that these days. "Well enough," he replied in a voice still scratchy with lingering fatigue. "And you?" She set aside the ledger. "I sleep, but dreams still find me. I see the dead pouring through the gates. Sometimes I see them scaling the walls. It passes, eventually." Jon gave a small nod. They both knew nightmares would hound them for a long time. He wrapped his hands around the warmth of the cup. "Any new news from the ravens?" he asked, taking a sip. The strong herbal flavor spread across his tongue. Sansa's gaze flicked downward. "We have a request for more grain from House Serwyn. The storm destroyed most of their remaining stockpiles. We can spare some." We've enough left, especially now that we're heading towards spring. Jon listened, mentally taking note of the small tasks needed to mend the north after so much devastation. Good, he said. We'll send what we can. She hesitated, then added, there's also a raven from Castle Black. They say the wildlings up near the Frostfangs discovered an entire abandoned camp. No bodies, just leftover gear, half-eaten rations. It could be more stragglers who fled the fighting, or bandits. She shook her head. Hard to say. Jon grimaced. The north was vast and harsh, dotted with unsettled land. Even now, with the undead defeated, survivors scattered about, desperate or lost. But the north had endured worse. We'll keep watch on it, he said. Send a scouting party to see if they need help or if they pose a threat. Sansa made a brief note on a scrap of parchment. I've asked Brienne to speak with them. She has a way of putting fear aside and seeking truth. He nodded, sipping his tea once more. Brienne of Tarth had proven invaluable. Her unwavering sense of honor complemented Sansa's quiet pragmatism. They made an efficient pair when dealing with lords who questioned a woman's authority, especially Sansa's, which was well-earned by now, but still eyed with caution by certain old families. The memory made him think of how quickly everything had changed. From the moment he found Drogon in that icy basin to the forging of alliances, to the final stand against the Night King. And now life continued. An odd quiet had settled over Winterfell's battered walls, as though the castle itself was drawing breath again. They spoke more of provisions and defense, then parted ways so Sansa could attend to a line of supplicants who needed the Lady of Winterfell's guidance. Jon rose and left the hall, Ghost padding at his heels. He walked through the courtyard, acknowledging a few respectful nods from guards. The place had been cleared of the worst debris left over from the battle. Charred stakes and broken cartwheels had been hauled away. Repairs to the battered walls were underway. Stonemasons hammered and chiseled in the crisp morning air. Along the ramparts, archers still stood watch, though the sense of perpetual vigilance had eased since the undead threat had been wiped out. As Jon passed through the open gates, he felt the brush of a familiar presence in his mind. Drogon, the dragon, wounded that night by an icy spear, had healed surprisingly fast. Each day, those black scales gleamed brighter, and the once torn membranes of his wings grew stronger. Now, Drogon often took to the skies at dawn, prowling the clouds or hunting in wide circles around the castle. The people in surrounding villages still spoke of him in hushed, trembling voices. Many had never seen a dragon before except in childhood stories. Yet so far, Drogon had caused no trouble. Perhaps it was because he sensed Jon's own caution. Perhaps it was because the north offered just enough game to slake the dragon's hunger. No one quite knew what to make of him, a beast of war that had saved them, or a monster that might one day turn on them. Fear mingled with awe at every mention of his name. Jon made his way beyond the walls, trudging through a light dusting of new snow. A group of children squealed and darted away, half thrilled, half frightened to see the man they called the Dragon Knight of Winterfell. Some of them were orphans from the war, taken in by kindly families or by Sansa's arrangement. He watched them run, noticing a bright glimmer in their eyes. The sort of hope the next generation might carry forward. The older generation bore too many scars to wear hope so lightly. A short walk brought him to a clearing at the edge of the godwood, near a line of ancient pines. There, Drogon lay curled, wings partially folded, spines glinting in the morning sun. Even half at rest, he projected a raw, coiled power. The heat that radiated from him melted the snow in a wide circle, revealing damp earth beneath. His golden eyes snapped open the moment Jon approached, and he lifted his great head. Ghost, bristling, gave a soft growl of caution as he always did at first. Drogon's pupils narrowed, but he made no threatening move. Slowly, calmly, Jon reached out and ran a hand along Drogon's scaled neck. The dragon's body was warm, humming with life. Jon studied the scar where the Night King's spear had grazed Drogon. The wound was all but healed, the black scale regrown around a faint pale line. "You're doing well," Jon murmured, though he didn't expect the dragon to understand words as Ghost or a horse might. Yet Drogon seemed to grasp his tone. He let out a soft growl that almost passed for contentment. Jon breathed in the sulfuric, charred smell that clung to Drogon's hide. He was reminded, as always, that this was no mere animal. The intelligence in Drogon's gaze was uncanny. Something in that stare made Jon think that if circumstances were different, the dragon might speak. But that, of course, was nonsense. He ran through the routine he'd developed over the last few weeks, checking Drogon's wings for tears or battered membrane, looking for damage to the spines, ensuring no scale was overly loose. Each time, Drogon tolerated the inspection with surprising patience. Some days, Jon held a chunk of meat from the kitchens and fed it to him, though Drogon preferred to hunt. Some days, he tried speaking in a quiet voice, letting the dragon grow accustomed to the presence of men without reacting with violence. This morning, after finishing his inspection, Jon patted Drogon's neck and said, "I might need your help today." He thought of the old keep half a league away where stonemasons were gathering fresh quarry. "We'll see." He led Drogon out of the Godswood clearing, Ghost trailing at a wary distance. Outside the protective cluster of trees, a flurry of motion among the castle's stables caught Jon's eye. Men paused to stare. He offered a silent greeting, a raised hand to let them know all was well. The watchers eased, though the tension remained. It would be a long while before the sight of a dragon in Winterfell became anything resembling normal. As Jon neared the wide, snow-packed field at the castle's southern boundary, he mounted Drogon in a practiced motion. He had fashioned a makeshift harness of strong leather straps, nothing as elaborate as a proper saddle, but it allowed him to grip without risking a broken neck should the dragon perform a sudden maneuver. Drogon let out a huff as if acknowledging the weight on his back. Jon gave Ghost a final nod, instructing the dire wolf to remain. Then, with a powerful snap of his wings, Drogon launched himself into the sky. The rush of air tore at Jon's cloak, and his stomach lurched with the familiar thrill of flight. They soared over the towers of Winterfell, the morning sun illuminating the partially iced moat and the stony parapets. Down below, he glimpsed guards pointing and calling out as the dragon's shadow swept across the courtyard. He saw Sansa appear on a rampart, shading her eyes to watch him. Even from above, he could sense her concern. He knew she worried each time he flew off, worried he might crash or be speared from the ground by some panicked archer, or that the dragon might buck him off mid-flight. But that fear never stopped her from supporting him. Jon hoped she would grow more comfortable in time. He guided Drogon in a wide arc, feeling the subtle shifts of weight beneath him as the dragon responded to his nudges. Over the last weeks, he had learned to rely on seat and legs more than reins, for the harness was only there to keep him secure. If he wanted Drogon to bank left, he shifted his weight, tapped lightly at the base of the neck spines on the left side. If he needed a descent, he leaned forward. It was intuitive, more like riding a horse than controlling a raven or eagle, but magnified 1,000-fold in power. Each flap of Drogon's wings was a thunderous pulse that vibrated through Jon's bones. They flew south over fields still white with lingering frost, past the ruins of makeshift fortifications used in the final battle against the undead. A hush settled over the land, the once bloody field now dotted with pyres long burned. Jon found himself glancing at the charred ground where so many had died. The memory pressed at his heart. Yet perhaps it was best to see it from above to remember the scale of what they had overcome. The White Walkers had been vanquished, the realm still stood. Ahead, a winding river glinted in the sunlight, half frozen. On its banks, teams of workers toiled in a quarry, chipping away at granite and loading it onto wagons. Jon guided Drogon lower. The workers below scattered at the sight. Many dropped tools and ran toward the safety of a nearby cluster of trees. He felt a pang of regret knowing they still feared the dragon, but there was no helping it. He brought Drogon down just beyond the quarry site, letting the dragon rest on a patch of relatively flat ground. Snow and dust whirled in every direction, sending loose bits of stone skidding. Several wagons threatened to tip over, horses neighing in alarm. Jon felt Drogon's body tense, but the dragon didn't release a torrent of flame. He simply folded his wings, gazing at the petrified workers with a flick of his long tail. Jon dismounted carefully, landing in a crouch. He raised both arms in a gesture of peace, stepping away from Drogon. "It's all right," he called to the stonemasons. "He won't harm you." Even to himself, the promise sounded tenuous, but he prayed Drogon had no reason to lash out. The workers, seeing that Jon wore stark black, gradually stopped running. One or two ventured closer, hats in hand, eyes wide. A bearded foreman approached. Lord Snow," he stammered. "We didn't expect that." His gaze flicked nervously to the dragon's scaled flank. Jon inclined his head in greeting. "I'm sorry to startle you. I needed to see how progress is going. We need more stone delivered to Winterfell as soon as possible. The masons are behind schedule repairing the outer wall." The foreman looked from Jon to Drogon and back again. "We can increase output, my lord." The men are working as fast as they can. It's just, we've had trouble with the wagons in the snow. He hesitated, glancing at the enormous beast with a mixture of fascination and fear. The roads are clearing, but we still get drifts that make it slow going. Jon eyed the loaded wagons. Each one was burdened with massive granite blocks. Pulling them through snow and rough terrain would indeed be a laborious task. A thought struck him, half-formed but compelling. He had seen Drogon carry him through the skies, carry himself with ease. Dragons were used in ancient days to shape the land, to destroy fortifications. Could Drogon help now in simpler tasks, like hauling stone? It sounded like folly, but part of him wondered if there was a more creative solution. I understand, he said. The men's safety is a priority. Keep working steadily. With spring on the horizon, the roads should clear enough for heavier loads soon. He paused, still grappling with the notion. Have you had any trouble with bandits or lawless men? The foreman nodded. Some. Nothing like an organized force. Just a few desperate souls. We haven't lost any men, though. A group of them approached last week, demanded some of our grain. When we refused, they fled. Jon frowned. The north was still full of scattered outlaws, remnants of those who refused to bend the knee or who had lost everything in the war and turned desperate. Stay vigilant, he said. We can send a patrol from Winterfell if you need protection. The foreman bowed in gratitude, murmuring that it might help. Jon promised to arrange it. Then he turned back to Drogon, who was sniffing at the rocky ground, wings twitching in mild impatience. The workers gave the dragon a wide berth, but the initial panic had eased. Jon placed a hand on Drogon's flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of the dragon's breath. Easy, he whispered. Drogon's golden eyes slitted and a low rumble vibrated in his chest. Jon lingered a few moments longer, ensuring the workers that the beast posed no threat unless provoked. Then he mounted once more. The harness squeaked under tension. With another powerful gust, Drogon launched into the air, blowing snow and grit in all directions. The workers shielded their faces. Up they rose, ascending over the quarry, the wind whistling past Jon's ears. In seconds, the ground below became small and distant. He circled once, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. To the west lay the broad fields leading toward the Bar Rolands, dappled with pockets of forest. To the east, the road wound back to Winterfell. His gaze fell on a lonely watchtower far to the north, standing silent amidst drifts of white. He guided Drogon toward it, descending to see if any watchers manned the tower. The flight took mere minutes. The tower had been used for ravens once, but now it seemed abandoned. If the White Walkers had come this way, they'd left nothing but emptiness behind. The door stood ajar, a battered sentinel sword left leaning against the wall. Jon landed Drogon nearby, but upon inspection found only echoing chambers and a leftover supply of salted fish. No living souls. It was a reminder of how the North still needed to be reconnected, how watchtowers and holdfasts must be resupplied or restaffed. This would take time. Yet time was a luxury that sometimes felt in short supply. While the undead threat had passed, rumors persisted of other unrest in the south. Whispers of Cersei Lannister's ambitions or Euron Greyjoy's fleet patrolling the coasts. And, of course, the looming question of Daenerys Targaryen. Did she still cross the narrow sea with the other dragons by her side? Would she come north in search of Drogon, the child she had lost? He tried not to dwell too deeply on that. Instead, he remounted and took flight once more, turning east this time, heading back toward Winterfell. The flight gave him space to think. The White Walkers were gone, but the rightful rule of the Seven Kingdoms remained in question. Once, that question had mattered little to Jon, so long as the Night King was defeated. But now, with the long night ended, the realm would look again to the Iron Throne. Would they accept a Targaryen queen who had freed slaves and built armies across the sea? Would they unite behind her? Or would they fear her dragons as they once feared Aegon's conquest? And where did Jon himself stand in that equation? He had the North's loyalty forged by blood and fire. He had the unwavering support of Sansa and the other surviving Starks. He had a dragon. Yet he did not see himself as a king. He had stepped away from such titles once he was named king in the North, focusing on a war that threatened all life. Back then he had never dreamed that the claims whispered by Samwell Tarly about Jon's parentage might hold truth. Part of him still wrestled with that revelation, uncertain if it changed anything or if it changed everything. He recalled the day Sam had confessed, trembling with excitement, that he'd uncovered an old record in the Citadel indicating Rhaegar Targaryen had annulled his marriage to Elia Martell and wed Lyanna Stark in secret. That union, Sam insisted, meant Jon was no bastard but a true-born Targaryen. Aegon Targaryen, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The words had burned into Jon's mind, fracturing his sense of self. But he had brushed them aside then, consumed by war. Now the knowledge lingered. A tension built between him and Sansa, unspoken. Should they tell the Lords of the North? Should they keep the secret hidden forever? If Daenerys arrived, would she accept another Targaryen claimant? Jon sighed into the freezing air, his breath whipped away by the wind. Drogon soared on, oblivious to the burdens of human lineage. Above them, a bank of clouds drifted, promising a midday snow flurry. He urged the dragon downward in a smooth glide, following the line of the White Knife River that snaked its way toward Winterfell. The castle soon came into view, squat and solid against the winter landscape. He landed in the same clearing beyond the walls, dismounted, and gave Drogon a hearty pat and thanks. The dragon snorted, almost in acknowledgement, then pulled away to nest among the pines, content to doze. Walking back through the gates, he gathered Ghost with a welcoming rub of the wolf's ears. The dire wolf sniffed at the lingering scent of dragon on Jon's cloak, his tail low. Jon found himself murmuring a few reassuring words. Ghost always seemed to regard Drogon with suspicion, though perhaps not outright hostility. Still, a part of Jon wondered if it was natural for the two beasts to remain standoffish. One was of ice, in a sense, the other of fire. Jon was the link between them, bridging an ancient divide. He had scarcely returned to the courtyard when one of the castle guards hurried to him, breath puffing in the cold. "My lord, Lady Sansa's asking for you in the hall. Lord Davos is with her, and a traveler arrived with urgent news. They're waiting." Jon nodded, feeling a prickle of apprehension. Urgent news rarely meant good tidings. He followed the guard, Ghost at his side, back into the great hall. The wide space brimmed wide. Fish activity, servants bearing trays of food, men warming themselves by the fire, the clatter of arms as a few soldiers cleaned their gear at a side table. Sansa stood near the dais, speaking in low tones with Davos and a cloaked figure whose face was shadowed by a hood. She turned at Jon's approach, relief crossing her features. "Jon," she said, beckoning him closer. "This man rode all the way from White Harbor. He brings word from across the narrow sea." Jon frowned. White Harbor maintained some trade routes even through winter, so letters sometimes came by ship. But crossing the narrow sea, something was stirring. Davos gave Jon a quick nod, then let the traveler speak. The man pulled back his hood, revealing weathered features and a salt and pepper beard. He looked exhausted, his clothes smeared with road dust, yet he carried himself with dignity. He bowed slightly to Jon. "My lord," he said, voice raspy from travel. "I am Rhaenar, a merchant in service to House Manderly. I come bearing news from Essos, though how accurate it is, I cannot say. Word spreads that Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen has set sail with her armies and her dragons. They say she will land in Westeros soon. Some rumors claim she's headed for Dragonstone. Others say Dorne." Jon felt a hollow echo in his chest, as though some inevitability had finally begun. He glanced at Sansa. She watched him carefully, gauging his reaction. Davos crossed his arms over his chest, brow furrowed. It was no secret that they had long expected Daenerys to arrive one day, but to hear that she was truly on the move changed the landscape of their plans. Rhaenar continued, "Her fleet is large, they say, ships from the Iron Islands under Yara Greyjoy, forces from Dorne, Unsullied, and Dothraki hordes. The talk in Volantis and Lys is that she means to take the Iron Throne. And there's talk, too, that she once had 3 dragons, but one is missing." The man's eyes flickered with uneasy curiosity. Jon's heart thudded. Word must have spread far and wide that Drogon, her largest dragon, had vanished. Perhaps only rumor had reached Essos that he was in the north. But how long until Daenerys herself learned the truth? And what would she do when she discovered that the bastard of Winterfell, if she even recognized his name, had found and bonded with her missing dragon? Sansa thanked Rhaenar for the news, then arranged for him to refresh himself in the kitchens. Once he was gone, she and Davos turned to Jon in the hush by the hearth. "She's coming," Davos said softly. "We knew it. She has 2 dragons with her, from what we hear. Will she want Drogon back? And if so, how will she approach us?" Jon raked a hand through his hair, wrestling with the knot of emotions. "If she truly has an army that large, she could march on King's Landing and take the throne by force," he said. "She might ignore the North entirely, at least at first." Sansa clasped her hands. Or she might not. She might come seeking her lost dragon to see if the rumors are true. The question is, what do we do if she comes knocking at Winterfell's gates? Silence fell for a moment. Then Jon exhaled. We can't hide Drogon, nor would I try. He's no secret to the people of the north. But does that mean we offer her an alliance, or do we hold her at bay? Davos said, I've heard men speak of her as a liberator in Essos, a breaker of chains. But I've also heard she can be ruthless. She crucified the masters of Meereen. She burned the Dothraki khals who stood against her. If we stand in her way, she might not hesitate to unleash her dragons. Yet if we yield, do we just trade the North's independence for a new Targaryen monarchy? Sansa's expression darkened. We've bled enough under the rule of Southern kings. But if she's truly the rightful queen, we must decide carefully how we greet her. Jon stared into the flickering flames of the hearth. He had no thirst for the Iron Throne, nor did he care to bend the knee for any monarch so long as the North was free to govern itself. But if Daenerys arrived with the intention to unify Westeros, could they stand alone and risk another war? Could they trust her, or would she see them only as a rebellious province? He said quietly we should prepare for her arrival. Strengthen Winterfell's defenses just in case. But I won't commit to open hostility. Too many have died in the wars already. If Daenerys Targaryen truly means to restore peace and prosperity, we should hear her out. We can't blindly oppose her. Nor will I just lay the North at her feet. Sansa nodded, though apprehension lingered in her eyes. We walk a fine line. Let's send ravens to the other houses. Let them know of Daenerys's approach and instruct them to remain vigilant. We should also consider if we want to invite her here on our terms or wait for her to come unannounced. Jon thought it over. An invitation might be a gesture of goodwill, but it could also be seen as weakness, as though they were summoning their new queen to kneel before her. On the other hand, if Daenerys came with her armies in tow, the entire North might feel invaded. I need time to think, he said at last. Let's gather more information first. Where exactly is she landing and who is supporting her? The more we know, the better we can negotiate if that's the path we choose. No immediate decision was reached, so they dispersed to their respective duties. Sansa wrote letters. Davos oversaw the training of new recruits who had been too young or too injured to fight in the recent war but still needed discipline. Jon found himself restless, pacing the courtyard. He felt the sting of memories, the swirl of duty and identity. The knowledge of his Targaryen blood pressed in on him, though he still wrestled with whether to reveal it to anyone beyond his close circle. He would not proclaim himself Aegon Targaryen. He had no desire to supplant Daenerys. And yet, if she were to discover it, he recalled the vow he once made to protect the realm from the dead. That vow had become entwined with the fate of all living souls. Now that the dead were gone, he faced a different future. His reflection in a pane of ice reminded him that he still wore the Stark sigil. He was raised as a Stark. He would die a Stark in spirit, no matter what his blood said. Drogon, though, belonged by birthright to Daenerys, if one believed in birthrights. The missing piece of her triumvirate of dragons had ended up in his hands. He told himself again that it was fate or the will of gods long silent. He spent that evening in the practice yard, venting his turmoil through sparring. Ser Brienne joined him at one point, her face set in concentration as their blades clashed. Neither fought in earnest, but each tested the other's reflexes and skill. The ring of steel echoed against stone. Jon found himself nearly disarmed by a deft twist of her longsword. He barely recovered in time. At the end, both stood panting, swords lowered. Brienne regarded him with level respect and said, "Your mind isn't fully on the fight, my lord." He nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. True enough. She sheathed her sword. A wise fighter knows that focusing only on the immediate blade in front of you leaves your flank exposed to what lies beyond. Stay mindful. She gave him a curt, respectful dip of her head. He recognized the subtext. If he worried too much about Daenerys or the politics to come, he might not see other dangers creeping in. That night, he sought the quiet of the godwood. Snow dusted the ancient weirwood's branches, the red leaves stark against the moonlit sky. Kneeling at the base of the tree, he tried to find solace in silent prayer. Overhead, the carved face in the trunk watched him with ancient, sightless eyes. He thought of Ned Stark and wondered what his father, no, his uncle, would have counseled. Ned always taught him about honor, about doing what was right, even when it was hard. But the realm of politics was a labyrinth of shifting alliances. Honor alone might not be enough. He whispered, "I don't know what to do," though he expected no answer. The wind stirred the branches. The faint hoot of an owl broke the silence. He took a steadying breath, letting the tension drain. At least they were alive to face these questions. The dead no longer threatened them. Whatever challenges Daenerys brought, they would be faced by living men and women, not whites with dead eyes. That was no small blessing. In the days that followed, word came that Daenerys had indeed landed at Dragonstone. Through watchers at White Harbor, Jon learned that her fleet had arrived with relatively little resistance. Rumors suggested she was sending emissaries to the lords of Westeros, proclaiming her intent to claim the throne. Some pledged fealty at once, others hesitated. Cersei Lannister still held power in King's Landing, though how firmly was uncertain. The news crackled through the north like a distant thunder. Winterfell was too remote to be Daenerys's first target. But eventually she would want the loyalty of the entire realm. Sansa and Davos advised caution but also recognized the advantage of forging an alliance before Daenerys marched north in force. Jon remained conflicted. He decided to send an envoy of his own to Dragonstone to make contact, someone who could speak for the north, gather facts, and gauge Daenerys's temperament. To his mild surprise, Lady Brienne volunteered. She believed her reputation as an honorable knight might grant her audience without hostility. With Sansa's blessing, Brienne set off with a small escort, sailing from White Harbor to Dragonstone. Jon hoped that Daenerys would show courtesy. He dreaded the possibility that Brienne might end up as a prisoner or worse. Still, it felt better than doing nothing. Weeks passed with no word. In that time, Winterfell continued to mend. Supplies from the Vale arrived, courtesy of Lord Royce, easing the burden of feeding the populace. Repairs to the outer wall neared completion. Trails once blocked by snow became passable. The blacksmiths, once dedicated to forging dragonglass weapons, now shifted to more mundane tasks, replacing nails, mending plows. Life settled into a quiet routine. Yet an undercurrent of tension remained. They were awaiting news of Daenerys or an approach by her armies or some new crisis. Gossip spread among the small folk that a Targaryen queen might burn the north with dragonfire if they didn't bend the knee, that Jon Snow was half a dragon himself and would drive her away, that the others might come back if the realms fought among themselves. Rumors had a life of their own. One morning, as Jon took another flight on Drogon, scanning the horizon for any sign of large marching forces, he saw something unexpected, a lone raven. That wasn't unusual, but this bird carried a bright ribbon on its leg, a sign of a special or urgent message. Circling, Jon tried to track its path. It seemed to be heading for Winterfell. He landed in the clearing moments before the raven perched on a watchtower. A guard retrieved it, unraveling the message and hurrying it to Sansa. By the time Jon walked into the great hall, the letter was in her hands. She beckoned him over, face alight with relief. "It's from Brienne," she said, her voice subdued yet laced with wonder. "She's met with Daenerys Targaryen at Dragonstone. Daenerys has invited the northern leadership to come and treat with her there, under a promise of safe conduct. Brienne says that the queen seems amenable to peaceful relations so long as the north acknowledges her claim." Jon's heartbeat quickened. "And Drogon?" "She knows," Sansa said, reading further. "It says here Daenerys expressed astonishment and some measure of anger that her dragon was gone for so long. But she seems more intrigued than furious. She wants to see Drogon with her own eyes, possibly to confirm he's truly healthy and loyal. Brienne suggests that if we are open to a formal alliance, we should go to Dragonstone as soon as we can, before Cersei tries to subvert Daenerys' cause or provoke a conflict that might force Daenerys to march." Jon pressed his lips together. So it had come to this, a summons to parley with the Dragon Queen. He sensed Sansa's unease. She would prefer to host Daenerys here, on northern soil. But a Targaryen might balk at traveling so far from her stronghold without certain guarantees. And with her newly established base at Dragonstone, Daenerys could greet visitors on her own terms. Sansa set the letter down. "If we go, we walk into her domain, where she holds every advantage. Yet if we refuse, we risk being seen as defiant. That could lead to war once she secures the south. Maybe it's best we meet her, show we aren't enemies. But there's something else." She hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. In a lower voice, she continued, "Brienne mentions that Daenerys' counselors know rumors of who you are. Perhaps not the details, but they suspect you're not just a Stark. There's talk of your parentage. It seems Varys, her spymaster, heard whispers of R plus L equals J from old maesters or archive scrolls. She hasn't acted on it publicly, but it's out there, Jon." He felt an icy weight settle in his stomach. The secret might be out of his control. "And how does Daenerys respond to the idea that I might be of her blood?" he asked, voice tight. Sansa shook her head. "Brienne's message doesn't say. Only that Daenerys remains fixated on Drogon's bond with you, as if it might confirm that you have Targaryen blood. I don't think she's declared anything. She might want to see you for herself. Jon closed his eyes for a moment, drawing a steadying breath. The time for secrecy might be over. He looked at Sansa, seeing her worried expression. We'll have to address it one way or another. She nodded. But how? His mind churned. Part of him wanted to remain Jon Snow, forever a Stark in spirit. Another part recognized that ignoring the truth could lead to confusion and mistrust. Daenerys might think he was trying to steal her claim, or she might suspect him of plotting behind her back. He had no desire for the Iron Throne. All he wanted was peace for the North, an end to war and chaos. Finally, he spoke. I'll go to Dragonstone. I'll bring an escort, and Drogon if that's her wish. I'll tell her the truth if it comes to that. But I won't press any claim. I'll make it clear the North wants to remain free and safe, nothing more. If she's reasonable, she'll see we have no quarrel. Sansa's lips tightened. You're certain you should bring Drogon? You could fly, yes, and get there quickly. But it leaves you exposed. You'll be alone in her territory. If something happens... He laid a reassuring hand on hers. I understand the risk, but if I arrive without Drogon, it might look like I'm hiding him or that I don't trust her. This might be the only way to show sincerity. And with Drogon by my side, I won't be so helpless if her intentions turn hostile. Davos arrived soon after, and they debated the plan. Ultimately, they agreed. Jon would lead a small company to Dragonstone, fewer than a dozen men, to maintain the appearance of a diplomatic mission. Davos would accompany him, along with a handful of loyal soldiers. Sansa would remain in Winterfell to govern in Jon's absence, ensuring the North's defenses stayed sharp. They set about making preparations at once. Within days, the party was ready. Wagons were packed with provisions. Horses readied. Davos insisted on bringing some barrels of the North's best salted fish as a token gift. Jon decided to take his father's sword, Longclaw, though he hoped he wouldn't need to draw it. He told Ghost to stay behind and guard Sansa, for traveling with both wolf and dragon might be too unpredictable. Ghost whined but seemed to understand. It pained Jon to leave him, but they had parted before, and Ghost had guarded those he cared for in times of danger. The morning of their departure arrived clear and cold, the sky the palest shade of blue. Sansa stood at the gates to see them off, her fur-lined cloak ruffling in the breeze. She clasped Jon's hands, searching his face. Be careful, she whispered. Remember that the Targaryens are not our friends by default. We lost family in the rebellion. They burned our grandfather and uncle in King's Landing. Jon held her gaze. That was the Mad King. Daenerys is not him. But I'll be cautious. She hesitated, then leaned forward to embrace him. He returned the gesture, feeling the tension in her shoulders. Come back safe, she said. There's still much to do here. With that, Jon gave a final nod to the assembled guards, mounted his horse, and led the party out of Winterfell. Drogon soared overhead, a living shadow against the sky, trailing them as they traveled south. It drew stares from every farm, holdfast, and crossroad along the way. Some folk cowered, others watched with fear-laced awe. It was the slow journey of a traveling retinue, mindful of the battered roads. But having a dragon circling above dissuaded would-be bandits or brigands. None dared attack. It took them nearly a fortnight to reach the outskirts of King's Landing's region, for they kept to well-known roads, occasionally pausing to rest. They saw no sign of Cersei's army, though rumors suggested her forces remained within the capital's walls. Bypassing the city, Jon's group skirted along the coast, heading for the rocky outcroppings that marked the approach to Dragonstone. There, the sea crashed against dark cliffs and the air smelled of brine and kelp. Atop a crag stood the imposing outline of Dragonstone's fortress, its towers shaped like dragons' tails and wings. Davos, traveling beside Jon, stared at the castle's silhouette with a mixture of memory and dread. I spent time here under Stannis, he murmured, remembering old battles and old loyalties. Feels strange coming back. Jon nodded. He recalled hearing stories of how Stannis Baratheon once held Dragonstone, how Davos served as his loyal hand. Now the fortress belonged to Daenerys, the last scion of the Targaryen dynasty. The approach to Dragonstone was treacherous, with steep roads winding up from a small landing area where ships could dock. A group of unsullied soldiers waited at the base, their spears glinting in the pale afternoon light. They wore helmets of a distinctive design, their faces impassive. Drogon circled above, roaring once as if announcing their arrival. As Jon and his party dismounted, one Unsullied stepped forward and spoke in a calm, measured voice. I am Grey Worm, commander of the Unsullied. Her Grace, Daenerys Stormborn, invites you within. You may keep your weapons, but use them at your peril. Any aggression will be met with force. Jon inclined his head. We come in peace to treat with the Queen. Grey Worm's dark eyes flickered to Drogon overhead. Your beast will wait outside the castle walls or in the courtyard if the Queen allows. She will decide. Jon glanced up, uncertain how Drogon would react to being penned anywhere. But the dragon soared lower, spied a wide courtyard within the castle's outer walls and landed there with a thunderous impact. Stone cracked beneath his claws. The Unsullied garrison within scrambled in alarm. But the beast merely folded his wings and let out a warning growl. Grey Worm signaled for his men to stand firm. With an exchange of pointed stares, the matter was settled. Drogon remained perched, apparently content, though tension rippled across his sleek body. Jon and Davos followed Grey Worm and the Unsullied up the winding path, flanked by a portion of their own men who eyed the fortress warily. The basalt walls, carved centuries ago by Targaryen craftsmen, aimed to brood over the sea. Overhead, gulls wheeled, crying in the salty wind. They passed under a massive gate shaped like a dragon's maw, entering a courtyard lined with weathered dragon statues. Ahead stood the doors to the Great Hall. Jon's heart pounded. He was about to meet Daenerys Targaryen face to face, a woman rumored to be the most powerful figure in the known world. Beyond that, he would see how she reacted to Drogon's bond with him. Every step echoed on the stone. Grey Worm led them through the hall's doors, revealing a cavernous chamber lit by torches. At its far end, a stone seat carved to resemble a coiled dragon tail overlooked the space. There Daenerys sat, regal and composed, her silver-gold hair braided away from her face. She wore a dark gown of intricate design, a three-headed dragon sigil at her breast. To her right stood a figure Jon recognized instantly from Brienne's descriptions, Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf with keen eyes and a sharper wit. To her left, a tall woman with smooth brown skin and watchful eyes, Missandei, the Queen's trusted advisor. Closer to the throne, in shadow, was another presence, a knight or guard who stood silent, observing. Jon could sense a tangible aura of power in the room. He advanced, aware of Davos and the few northern men flanking him. He stopped at an appropriate distance and inclined his head. Your Grace, he began, forcing calm into his voice. I am Jon Snow, Warden of the North. This is Ser Davos Seaworth, and these are my men. Thank you for receiving us. Daenerys regarded him, her gaze cool but not hostile. Welcome to Dragonstone, Jon Snow. She did not smile, though her tone carried a hint of curiosity. I have heard many things about you, that you were once king in the north, that you rose from the dead, that you ride my dragon as though you have a right to him. Quite the tales. Jon held her gaze, feeling a trace of heat flush his cheeks. The realm needed unity against the undead. I set aside the title of king in the north to rally allies. We fought the Night King and prevailed. And as for your dragon, I found him wounded in the far north. I helped him heal. We became bonded. I never planned to steal him. A flicker of emotion crossed Daenerys's face, relief, sadness, perhaps longing. Drogon was always the fiercest of my children, she said softly, the slightest quaver in her words. He vanished over the sea during a storm. I searched, but found no trace. I thought him lost forever. Now I find he is alive in your hands. Her eyes narrowed slightly. So you will understand if I am cautious. Tyrion stepped forward. Your Grace, we should remember that he saved the 7 kingdoms from a threat that might have destroyed us all. We owe him at least a fair hearing. Daenerys nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on Jon. Tell me, Jon Snow, why come here now, after everything? Do you seek my permission to keep Drogon as your pet? The question bristled. Jon carefully chose his reply. Drogon is no pet. He's a living being with his own will. But I acknowledge that you are his mother, in a way. Dragons are bound to their riders, and I can't claim to understand every nuance of that bond. I only know we formed a connection, and I've used the bond to protect people from a great evil. It was never my intention to take him from you. I came here to offer peace, to see if there's a future where the North and your cause don't stand at odds. And he added, with more hesitation, to see how Drogon himself chooses to respond in your presence. Daenerys studied him for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then she flicked her gaze at Tyrion. You see, my lord hand? He speaks with sincerity. And he's raised an important point, Drogon's choice in the matter. She rose from her seat in a graceful motion, descending a few steps. She was shorter than Jon expected, yet there was a commanding presence in her posture. She paused a few feet away, her voice quiet. I would see Drogon at once. Will you take me to him? Jon glanced at Davos, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. This was uncharted territory, but refusing would seem like a slight. Jon turned back to Daenerys. Of course. She gestured for Grey Worm and Missandei to remain behind, though Tyrion stepped forward, apparently included in her entourage. The mysterious guard in the shadows also emerged, a tall man in black armor, half his face scarred. Jon recognized him as Jorah Mormont. He felt a jolt of recognition. House Mormont was from the north, though Jorah had been exiled long ago. Jorah returned Jon's gaze but said nothing, keeping pace with Daenerys. They walked side by side out of the hall, down the corridors to the courtyard where Drogon awaited. As they approached, Jon heard the low rumble of the dragons breathing. They emerged into the open air, battered by a gust of salty wind. Drogon towered there, wings partially unfurled, letting out a restless snarl at the sight of unfamiliar faces. Unsullied guards stood at a cautious distance, spears at the ready, though they seemed uncertain what good those weapons would do. Daenerys paused, inhaling sharply, her eyes bright with emotion. She took a step forward, ignoring the tension among her guards. Drogon, she whispered, voice tremoring. The dragon cocked his head, pupils contracting at the sound of her voice. Jon saw recognition flicker across Drogon's eyes, like the memory of a distant dream. Daenerys raised a trembling hand, her face etched with longing. Drogon, she repeated, quieter. In that charged moment, Jon watched as Drogon lowered his neck just enough to smell Daenerys's outstretched hand. A hush fell as though everyone present held their breath. Then, with a rush of air, Drogon drew back, letting out a short, unsure growl. He didn't set her aflame, nor did he press forward in affection. He seemed torn between old familiarity and new wariness. Jon felt his heart tighten, worried that Drogon might reject her after so long. But Daenerys took another step, fearless. My child, she murmured. I have missed you. Her voice carried a heartbreaking tenderness. Drogon hissed softly, sniffing the air around her. Jon could see the muscles in the dragon's shoulders tense, as though uncertain. Then Drogon dipped his head a little closer, almost a bow. Daenerys laid her palm on the warm scales of his snout, tears shining in her violet eyes. A ripple of relief passed through Jon. Drogon remembered her, at least in part. The dragon had not turned savage or broken the bond they once shared. Daenerys stood there, stroking Drogon's scales as though reacquainting with a lost child. The scene carried a potent emotional weight. Behind her, Tyrion and Jorah exchanged glances, also relieved. Jon hovered nearby, uneasy, not wanting to intrude on the reunion. Then, after a moment, Daenerys turned her gaze to him. She beckoned subtly, as though inviting him to join them. Jon stepped forward, resting a hand on Drogon's flank. He felt the dragon's heat, the living pulse beneath the scales. Drogon did not shy away or snarl, instead permitting the two humans to stand together at his side. A strange calm settled over the courtyard. The Unsullied lowered their spears slightly. A flight of seabirds cried overhead, circling the spires of Dragonstone. Daenerys exhaled. He's grown, she said softly, a tremor in her voice. And he's been through much. I can see the faint scars. Her eyes flicked to Jon. Thank you for saving him. I had feared him dead. Jon merely nodded, unsure how to respond. A swirl of complicated feelings rose in him, but he had no words to adequately express them. Finally, Daenerys stepped away, letting her hand fall to her side. She regarded Jon with a measured gaze. We have much to discuss, Jon Snow. But first, let us agree that Drogon's well-being matters to us both. If he has chosen you as a rider, that is extraordinary. Dragons rarely accept new riders, especially not without Targaryen blood. Unless, she broke off, her gaze suddenly sharp. Tyrion cleared his throat, as if sensing the conversation's precarious turn. Yes, well, perhaps we should continue inside, away from the wind. This is a delicate matter. Daenerys nodded. She looked at the dragon once more. Stay, she said softly, though it was more an entreaty than a command. Drogon rumbled, half-lowered his head, as if to rest or doze. He seemed calm enough for now, not threatened by the fortress's new inhabitants. The tension in the courtyard eased, if only slightly. Together, they returned to the Great Hall. There, around a large table shaped in the map of Westeros, once used by Stannis, and before him by the Targaryens, they gathered. Daenerys sat at one side, Jon and Davos at the other. Tyrion stood behind her, arms folded, while Jorah and Missandei flanked the edges. The light of torches cast dancing shadows over the carved coastline of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon's gaze drifted to the north, etched in wood, reminding him of home. Daenerys spoke first. I have claimed the Iron Throne by right of birth. As Aegon the Conqueror once did, I intend to unite the Seven Kingdoms. I mean to break the wheel of tyranny and the oppression that plagued Westeros for generations. Cersei Lannister clings to power in King's Landing, but her grasp weakens. Many houses have already rallied to my side. But the North? You have declared independence in the past. Now you come here, bearing my lost dragon. I need to know where you stand. Jon took a breath. The North has suffered deeply under southern rulers, be they Targaryen, Baratheon, or Lannister. We fought the Night King with minimal help from the rest of the realm, aside from those loyal to House Stark's cause. We value our autonomy and the freedom to govern ourselves. Yet I do not seek a new war. We bled enough. If you come offering peace and mutual respect, I will listen. Her eyes narrowed, though not in hostility, more in careful consideration. So you would have me grant the North independence while I claim the rest of Westeros? Is that what you propose? Jon hesitated. The North has always been different. We remember the days before Aegon's conquest. Yet if you are truly a benevolent ruler, perhaps an arrangement can be made if you understand our need to be governed by our own traditions. We can be allies if you allow us to remain free or at least grant us a special status. He stopped, feeling the weight of her gaze. Daenerys looked thoughtful, though Tyrion intervened. Your Grace, it might be wise to consider a compromise. The realm needs stability. Forcing the North back under the Iron Throne by fire and blood would only breed resentment. But forging an alliance, one where the North maintains a measure of self-rule, could bring them peacefully into the fold. At least, in principle. We would have to negotiate specifics, of course. Davos cleared his throat. We're open to negotiations. But let's be clear, the last time a Targaryen ruled, my lords, the North saw Brandon and Rickard Stark burned alive in King's Landing. We cannot forget that. Even if we know you're not your father, your Grace, many in the North still recall that pain. A flash of anger sparked in Daenerys' eyes at the mention of her father's atrocities, but she reined it in. I am not my father, she said, voice steady. I don't intend to use wildfire or burn my opponents alive without cause. But unity is essential if we are to prevent future disasters. If the realm remains fractured, lords might rise against each other, and countless small folk suffer. She paused. Moreover, the realm does not simply consist of humans. We have learned that the dead rose once. Could they rise again? Will there be another threat? We must be strong together. Jon inclined his head, acknowledging the truth in her words. We share the same goal, peace and security. If an alliance can achieve that without forcing the North into vassalage, then I'm willing to explore it. But I have one more matter to speak of. He let out a slow breath. My parentage. A hush fell. Tyrion pursed his lips. Daenerys' eyes flicked to Missandei, who wore a puzzled expression, then back to Jon. Go on, Daenerys said quietly. Jon braced himself. I was raised as a Stark bastard, but the truth discovered by my allies is that I am not Ned Stark's son. I am his nephew. My mother was Lyanna Stark, and my father was Rhaegar Targaryen, your brother. The silence became absolute. Even the crackle of torches seemed to stop. Daenerys' face went pale. Her lips parted in shock. Tyrion's eyes darted between them, calculating the ramifications. Jorah stiffened, one hand on the hilt of his sword as though uncertain how Daenerys would react. Davos lowered his gaze, as if the admission pained him, though he stood by Jon's side. Daenerys inhaled sharply. That can't. Rhaegar's children died in the sack of King's Landing. Everyone knows that. They were. Viserys always said Rhaegar's children with Elia Martell died. Jon interjected softly. But Rhaegar annulled that marriage, married Lyanna in secret. She died in childbirth, leaving me with her brother, Ned Stark. He raised me as his own to protect me from Robert Baratheon's wrath. If the documents and testimonies we found are correct, I am legitimate. By law, that might make me Aegon Targaryen. I tell you this not to claim the throne, but to be honest about who I am. Daenerys stared at him, hands trembling. If this is true, you are my nephew. The realization bled through her voice, a swirl of confusion and sudden family ties. You have a claim to the Iron Throne that could rival mine. Jon shook his head firmly. I do not want it. I have no desire to sit on the Iron Throne. The North is my home. My life has been devoted to protecting it. I only reveal this because if we are to trust each other, there must be no secrets. Tyrion let out a long breath, stepping forward. Your Grace, he said to Daenerys. This changes the lineage question drastically, But it doesn't have to change your plans. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, has clearly stated he does not wish to pursue the throne. There need not be conflict. On the contrary, this might solidify an alliance between you, if managed properly. Daenerys's wide eyes flicked over Jon's features, as though searching for traces of her brother or the Targaryen line in his face. You look like a Stark, she said quietly, voice faint. But the blood of the dragon flows through you, that much is clear now. Drogon accepted you for a reason. She swallowed hard, grappling with an avalanche of emotion. I won't lie, this is difficult news. My claim was always predicated on being the last Targaryen. Now I find I am not the last, and that you, in the eyes of some, might be the rightful heir. I need time to think. Jon nodded, relief and worry mingling in his chest. Take all the time you need. I don't seek to undermine you. My loyalty is to the North. But if our shared blood can help us find common ground, then I welcome it. He paused. Perhaps it's better that the Targaryen line isn't extinguished. She pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly. Yes, she whispered. Yes, perhaps it is. 1,000 thoughts seemed to war behind her eyes about legacy, destiny, the iron dictates of birthright. At length, she found a measure of composure. We will speak more of this in private when the shock has settled. For now, let us discuss the immediate question, does the North stand with me, or apart from me as I move to take King's Landing from Cersei Lannister? Jon considered. If you can agree to respect the North's distinct identity and autonomy, that we will not be forced to kneel as we once did, then I can promise that we will not oppose you. Indeed, we may help you rid the throne of a Lannister who brought ruin to many. But we want assurances that you will not drag our people into another war that doesn't concern us. Daenerys dipped her head. I can promise not to force the North under my heel. If you wish a special status, I will grant it. But I do need your moral support, if not your banners, in the fight to come. Can we find that compromise? Jon exchanged a glance with Davos, then nodded. We can. Let's put it in writing. A formal agreement. He dared to let a small smile tilt his lips. You may find that your war with Cersei concerns us more than you think. The North remembers how the Lannisters betrayed our house. We are not eager to see Cersei remain in power. Something eased in Daenerys's posture, though her gaze still flickered with 100 questions unasked. Very well, she said quietly. Let us draw up an accord. Tyrion, you will handle the legalities. The dwarf inclined his head. With pleasure, your grace. I've never had to craft a royal document acknowledging partial independence for an ancient kingdom under the rule of a Targaryen queen while also factoring in the existence of a newly discovered Targaryen claimant, but I do love a challenge. Davos almost smiled at his wry tone, tension lifting slightly. They gathered around the map table, discussing the details. The North would maintain its own warden, its own customs, and a lesser tribute or tax than the rest of the realm. It would answer the Crown's call for aid only in existential threats or if it so chose. In return, the North recognized Daenerys's right to rule the rest of Westeros and agreed not to support any opposing claimants. Jon's personal vow not to seek the throne was made explicit. The entire arrangement would be sealed with signatures and witnesses to be ratified after Cersei's defeat. Until then, it remained contingent on Daenerys's success. At times, Tyrion paused to glance at Daenerys and Jon, eyes thoughtful. He seemed to sense the deeper tension swirling between them, both the possibility of kinship and the question of how it might shape the future. But he kept any commentary to himself, focusing on the document's language. Missandei offered suggestions, ensuring the text reflected Daenerys's intentions accurately. Davos, standing by Jon's side, occasionally corrected points that might undermine Northern authority. After hours of discussion, they arrived at a preliminary understanding. The scroll was drafted, though not yet sealed. Daenerys sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. It's been a long day, she said softly. I need rest. Tomorrow, we can discuss the matter of how we confront Cersei and whether the North will send any forces or not. For now, let us adjourn. Jon bowed slightly, fatigue pressing at his own bones. Traveling for so long, then the emotional weight of revealing his parentage had drained him. Davos gave him a supportive pat on the shoulder. Tyrion asked him to remain behind a moment to ensure the drafted agreement was to his liking. Daenerys stood and departed with Missandei, Yora following at a respectful distance. Jon couldn't help but watch her go, a swirl of complicated feelings churning inside him. Her slender form seemed heavier with burdens than he'd expected of a conqueror. He wondered if she felt as alone in her cause as he had once felt beyond the wall. Tyrion cleared his throat. I know that look, he said in a low voice. You're worried about how she's taking all this. Give her time, Jon. She's lost so much, and now she's gained a nephew she never knew she had, one who shares her blood and a bond with her prized dragon. She's reeling. Jon exhaled. I don't want to cause her trouble. I just had to be honest. And that honesty may be the beginning of something stronger than either of you realize. Tyrion rolled up the parchment. I'll keep the safe for now. We can finalize it in a public ceremony once the queen decides her next step. In the meantime, get some rest. You will. I'll find the chambers prepared for you at the Eastern Tower. Davos knows the way. With that, Tyrion gave a half bow and exited. Jon trudged out of the hall, accompanied by Davos. They climbed the narrow staircases of Dragonstone, passing corridors lit by flickering torches, listening to the distant roar of the sea beyond the walls. Davos guided him to a modest set of rooms, stone walls carved with images of dragons. A brazier burned to ward off the chill. The bed was simple but clean. Jon sank onto it, letting out a weary breath. Davos settled on a nearby bench, rubbing his neck. Well, that went better than I feared, he said. She didn't burn us alive, nor did she imprison you for claiming a Targaryen birthright. Maybe this might actually work. Jon managed a small, tired smile. Let's hope so. All I want is for the North to be safe. If that means an alliance with Daenerys, I'll take it. But I can't pretend the idea of being her nephew doesn't complicate things. Davos shrugged. Politics is often complicated. At least you're not alone in it. Sansa will be proud to hear how you navigated all this. Jon nodded, though a flicker of doubt gnawed at him. Sansa might also worry that Daenerys would use their blood relation to demand more from the North, or that Jon might be swayed by Targaryen ties. He didn't have answers for that yet. Exhaustion weighed on him, beckoning him to sleep, though he knew the night would be fraught with restless thoughts. He rose, patted Davos's shoulder. Get some rest yourself, my friend. Tomorrow's another day of negotiations. Davos inclined his head and left for his own chambers. Alone, Jon stripped off his armor and boots, letting them clatter to the floor. He moved to the window, peering out at the moonlit sea. The crash of waves filled his ears. Somewhere below, Drogon likely perched in the courtyard or soared over the fortress, reacquainting himself with the ancient seat of his ancestors. The memory of Daenerys standing by Drogon, tears in her eyes, tugged at Jon's heart. She was mother to the beast, yet somehow Jon had become another bond. He couldn't quite put the feeling into words. An odd mixture of guilt, wonder, and kinship. He murmured a silent prayer that tomorrow would bring clarity. Then he climbed into bed, drawing the blankets around him to ward off the chill. Sleep came in fitful waves, haunted by dreams of dragons, the swirling shapes of lost kings, and the flicker of a burning throne. He dreamed of a monstrous red keep bathed in green fire, of 1,000 ravens cawing from a broken tower, of a dire wolf and a dragon locked in an endless dance over a frozen field. Yet amid the chaos, a faint voice whispered that a new spring was coming. He clung to that hope. Dawn's first light found him stirring awake, head pounding with unresolved tension. He donned fresh clothes, splashed cold water on his face, and made his way down to the courtyard. There, Unsullied silently patrolled, their discipline impressive. No sign of Drogon perched within the high walls, but a guard informed Jon that the dragon had flown out to sea at first light, possibly hunting. Jon was relieved Drogon could roam freely without sparking a war. He asked for directions to the hall where breakfast would be served, though the guard gestured that the queen often broke her fast privately. Still, Jon found a small meal in a side chamber, bread, fish, and mild ale. He ate quickly. Davos joined him, yawning, complaining about the stiff salt air that reminded him of his smuggler days. They were discussing the day's plan when Missandei appeared, bowing politely. Her grace would speak with you both in her solar, she said, if you're willing. They followed her along winding corridors until they reached a smaller, more intimate chamber than the great hall. Windows overlooked the sea. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and a large wooden table stood at the center, scattered with maps and letters. Daenerys was there, dressed in a lighter gown than yesterday, a silver clasp shaped like a dragon at her shoulder. She looked composed but weary, as though she hadn't slept well either. She nodded a greeting. Jon Snow. Ser Davos. Sit, please. They took seats, and Missandei poured them each a cup of steaming tea. Daenerys sipped hers, then spoke. I have given thought to the arrangement we discussed. I believe we can find a middle ground, one that grants the North its freedoms and cements an alliance between us. But there is another matter. I intend to march on King's Landing soon to unseat Cersei. I cannot do it alone. Her forces are formidable and she has alliances of her own. The Iron Fleet, possibly some Cell's words. I ask if the North will aid me. Not with a full levy if that burdens you, but with a contingent of men who will stand by my side. Show the realm that we are united. Jon considered, glancing at Davos. The older man looked pensive. Finally, Jon said, many in the North will be reluctant to march south again. We've lost so many already. But if this is the price for forging peace with you and ensuring that a just ruler sits the throne, we can provide a modest force. Enough to show solidarity. Daenerys inclined her head, a faint smile ghosting her lips. That is all I ask. I won't demand you strip the North of every man, only a token support to demonstrate that the North does not stand idle while I free the realm from a tyrant. They spoke further, ironing out details. Tyrion arrived partway through, scribbling notes, offering suggestions on how to handle the optics. If Daenerys marched on King's Landing with even a small northern contingent at her side, it might sway undecided lords. Others might fear a union of Targaryen dragonfire and northern resilience. It was a calculated move. Jon agreed it might help end the conflict faster, with fewer lives lost. Davos cautioned about the potential for hatred from the small folk who might see a foreign queen subjugating them, but Tyrion insisted that many of the small folk in the Crownlands already despised the Lannisters for the endless wars. By midday they had an outline of a plan. Jon would return to Winterfell to gather a volunteer force of experienced soldiers, perhaps a few thousand. He would also bring Sansa and any other northern lords willing to witness the final push. In the meantime, Daenerys would consolidate her positions with her current allies, the Tyrell remnants, the Martells in Dorne, and the Ironborn loyal to Yara. As for King's Landing, Tyrion proposed a strategy of siege combined with infiltration. He believed many within the capital would revolt against Cersei if given a chance. Daenerys listened, though Jon sensed her impatience. She wanted to end Cersei's reign swiftly. Amid these war councils, the personal tension between Jon and Daenerys persisted. Occasionally, Jon caught her studying him when she thought he wasn't looking, as though trying to reconcile the image of him as a Stark with the knowledge that he was also a Targaryen. Yara, too, watched Jon with a carefully guarded expression, perhaps unsure if this new family tie would upset Daenerys' destiny. Tyrion played the diplomat, bridging awkward silences with carefully timed jokes or insights. That evening, after a full day of discussions, Jon found himself alone on a balcony overlooking the sea. The sky blazed with sunset colors, orange, pink, and gold shimmering over the waves. A crisp wind tugged at his cloak. He closed his eyes, inhaling the salt air. On the horizon, he imagined shapes of ships or whales, though it might have been just the glimmer of sunlight on water. The hush felt welcome after so many spoken words. Footsteps behind him, Daenerys. He turned to see her approach, cloak fluttering. She stopped a few paces away, arms folded against the chill. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the hush of the ocean beneath them. She spoke softly, I wanted to speak without the weight of advisors or guards. Just us. Jon inclined his head. Of course. She studied his face, her expression pensive. This news of our blood tie, I'll admit it unsettles me. I spent much of my life believing I was the last Targaryen, carrying the hopes of my house alone. Now I learn you exist. By the old ways, you might outrank me. Yet you claim you don't want the throne. Are you certain of that? Are you certain you won't wake one day and decide to press your claim? He met her gaze steadily. I'm certain. My life has been in the North, defending my people. Being king, queen, or any form of ruler over the 7 kingdoms, none of that has ever called to me. I don't want it. I meant what I said. I support your claim if you honor the North's right to self-rule. Relief softened her features, though a glimmer of doubt remained. Then we can stand together. But I wonder. Do you feel no sense of connection to the legacy of our house? It's in your blood. You ride a dragon. Doesn't a part of you burn with the desire to embrace that heritage? He hesitated, glancing at the sea. I won't deny that bonding with Drogon stirred something in me. A sense of belonging to something ancient. But it doesn't erase my loyalties to House Stark, the family that raised me. Maybe I'll never fully reconcile those two halves. But my choice stands. I am Jon Snow. A faint smile curved her lips. I understand. More than you might think. I was raised in exile, taught that Westeros was rightfully mine, yet for years I drifted in foreign lands, forging my own identity. I became more than just Daenerys Targaryen, rightful queen. I became a breaker of chains, a mother of dragons. She paused. Now you stand at a crossroads as I once did. Perhaps we can help each other find balance. Jon offered a small nod. I hope so. For the sake of the realm. They stood in companionable silence, the wind combing through their hair. The waves crashed against the rocks below, sending up white foam. The last rays of the sun caught on Daenerys' hair, giving it a halo-like glow. In that moment, Jon felt a strange warmth and understanding that they were bound by more than blood or politics. They were both survivors of great trials, both burdened by the expectations of their lineages. He remembered how she looked, tears in her eyes as she touched Drogon, and realized she wasn't just a conqueror. She was a woman who had lost much, who carried her own heartbreak and hope. He took a breath, breaking the silence. I should return to Winterfell soon. The men will need time to organize. Sansa will want to discuss the final terms. Is there anything else you need from me before I go? She shook her head, though her gaze lingered. Only that you promise to return with your men, that we might end this war swiftly. And that you keep our alliance in confidence until we can declare it together. The sooner we remove Cersei from power, the sooner we can shape a better realm. Jon nodded. You have my word. They parted ways in the hall. That night, Tyrion arranged a small feast to celebrate the new partnership. The castle's modest stores of wine were tapped, fish and shellfish from the local waters served. Though the gathering was more subdued than a traditional feast, a sense of cautious optimism floated among the participants. Jorah spoke quietly with Davos about the north, about Bear Island, though there was a tension in his eyes at being so close to a homeland he had betrayed. Missandei exchanged stories with the few northerners present, fascinated by the differences in culture. Daenerys conversed with Jon only in passing, though each time their gazes met, it felt layered with unspoken understanding. In the morning, Jon prepared to depart. Drogon reappeared from his nighttime roaming, alighting on the castle walls with a roar that rattled loose stones. Daenerys stood by as Jon donned his harness. He had few words to say, most of the negotiations were concluded, at least in principle. Tyrion gave him the final version of their draft agreement, sealed with Daenerys' sigil. Jon would bring it to Sansa for her review. Both parties left room for adjustments, but the gist of their alliance was set. Before he mounted Drogon, Daenerys stepped forward one last time. She reached out, clasping Jon's hand. The gesture carried a solemn weight. Fly safe, she whispered. I'll expect your return in a fortnight, if possible. Jon squeezed her hand gently. Farewell, your grace. A moment later, he pulled himself onto Drogon's back. The dragon shifted, snorting. With a thunderous beat of his wings, he launched skyward. The onlookers scrambled to shield their eyes from swirling dust. Daenerys stood with her cloak snapping in the wind, face turned up, hair whipping around her shoulders. Jon watched her grow smaller as Drogon climbed higher, the fortress of Dragonstone shrinking beneath them. He steered Drogon north, the wind lashing his cheeks with brine. Despite the tension that lay ahead, winning over the northern lords, rallying a volunteer force, and convincing Sansa that the alliance was worth the risk, he felt a measure of hope. Perhaps the realm truly could be united without another bloodbath. Perhaps the Targaryen legacy didn't have to be one of madness and cruelty. And perhaps, in some corner of his heart, he felt less alone, knowing there was someone else in this world who shared his blood, who understood the strange burden of a dragon's bond. The flight back took days, broken by stops for rest and hunting. Each time they landed near a village or holdfast, folk gawked at the dragon in terrified wonder, but word had spread that Jon Snow controlled a dragon, so no one attacked. By the time they reached the familiar expanse of the north, Jon's mind churned with how to present this new alliance to Sansa and the other lords. He knew some would resist any pact with the Targaryen. Others might see advantage in toppling the Lannisters. Sansa would weigh the risks. He only hoped she would see the potential good. At last, the walls of Winterfell emerged on the horizon, half covered in snow. Drogon's roar announced their arrival. Once more, the courtyard was thrown into a commotion. But the guards had grown somewhat accustomed to the dragon's landings. They stood firm, though anxious. Sansa rushed out, flanked by Brienne and a handful of bannermen. She blinked against the whipping wind as Drogon settled, steam rising from his nostrils in the cold air. Jon dismounted, stumbling slightly from fatigue. He offered Sansa a tired smile. She embraced him fiercely, ignoring the swirl of dust. Ghost bounded forward, barking and wagging his tail. Jon nearly laughed at the chaos of warmth. When Sansa drew back, her gaze was sharp with questions. Well, how did it go? Jon gestured for Davos, who dismounted his horse, to join them. We have a tentative agreement, he said. The North remains largely independent under Daenerys' reign, pays minimal tribute, and is not obligated to join her wars except this once to unseat Cersei. She needs a token force to stand beside her when she marches on King's Landing to show the realm that the North supports her claim. He sighed. She's not the Mad King, Sansa. I think we can trust her more than I feared. Sansa's eyes flicked to Drogon, then back to Jon. Did you tell her about your father? Jon nodded. Yes. She knows. It complicated things, but we've come to an understanding. I've made it clear I don't want the throne. He held out the sealed parchment. Here's the draft. Read it. Share it with the lords. We can refine it, but Daenerys wants an answer soon. She'll be marching on King's Landing in a matter of weeks. Sansa took the parchment, expression guarded. Then let's waste no time. She turned to the assembled crowd, raising her voice. Prepare the Great Hall. Summon the lords if they're here, or their representatives. We have urgent matters to discuss. Her tone brooked no delay. Jon caught her hand briefly. Thank you. She dipped her head, though her eyes remained troubled. We shall see if the lords of the North agree. This is unprecedented. Together, they walked through the gates, leaving Drogon to lounge in the courtyard. Ghost pranced at Jon's side, sniffing him all over as though scolding him for staying away so long. The fortress's familiar walls enclosed them, a stark contrast to the carved basalt of Dragonstone. A swirl of nostalgia and relief filled Jon. He was home. Yet new responsibilities weighed on him. The realm's future balanced on these fragile alliances. He and Sansa made their way to the Great Hall, where a fire roared in the hearth. Lords who happened to be in Winterfell, Manderly, Serwyn, Glover, arrived swiftly, curiosity piqued by Drogon's landing. They gathered around as Sansa broke the seal on the parchment, reading aloud its provisions. Murmurs swept the room. Some scoffed. Others listened with pensive frowns. When she finished, eyes turned to Jon, brimming with questions. Lord Glover, arms folded over his thick chest, spoke first. You would have us bend the knee to this Targaryen queen after all we've suffered at the hands of southern rulers? Jon answered calmly, not bend the knee. She's offering near independence so long as we acknowledge her as queen of the realm. We keep our traditions and mostly govern ourselves. It's far better than anything we've had before. And in return, we help her remove Cersei Lannister, our old enemy, from power. Lord Manderly tugged at his beard. And what if this Daenerys turns on us once she's queen? Words are wind. She has 2 other dragons, does she not? Jon met the older man's gaze. She gave her word and we have a written accord. Besides, if she turns on us, we'll fight back. We've proven we can handle 1 dragon, he said, half smiling. She has no desire to provoke another war. Her power is already great. She has no need to subdue the North by force when we're offering her alliance. Lyanna Mormont was not present. She was tending to Bear Island's recovery, but her uncle, older and wizened, stepped forward. We are few, battered by wars and the undead. What can we truly offer this Targaryen in a fight against the Lannisters? Jon spoke plainly. We can offer enough soldiers to show we stand with her. A few thousand, perhaps, volunteers who wish to avenge the Red Wedding or the horrors inflicted on our people by Tywin and Cersei Lannister. That might be enough to tip the balance. The rest can remain here to rebuild. No forced conscription. Sansa let her voice ring out. House Stark endorses this alliance. We've bled alone for too long. Now, with peace on the horizon, we have a chance to secure our independence and free the realm of Cersei's cruelty. It is a risk, yes, but one we believe worth taking. Discussion flared among the lords, some vigorously opposed, others cautiously in favor. Ghost lingered at Jon's side, watchful. Davos offered a few calming words, recounting how Daenerys freed thousands of slaves in Essos. The debate lasted for hours. In the end, a fragile consensus emerged. They would accept the terms, but only a volunteer force would be sent. No house would be compelled to part with men it needed for winter survival. Yet many saw the advantage of finishing off the Lannisters once and for all. That evening, Sansa and Jon conferred in the small council chamber, going over the final details. They drafted a response letter to Daenerys confirming acceptance of the terms. They invited her to send a representative to finalize the agreement in Winterfell or meet them on the road once they marched. Sansa would remain in Winterfell to govern and ensure the North's security, while Jon would lead the volunteer force south. The logistics were immense, assembling thousands of men, ensuring supply Ines, leaving enough behind to keep the North safe. But at least the lords were on board, if begrudgingly. After the letters were written, sealed, and sent with ravens, Sansa sank into a chair, fatigue etching her features. Jon stood by the window, staring into the cold night. A gentle snow fell outside. The flicker of torchlight illuminated the courtyard where Drogon lay coiled, glowing embers beneath the dusting of flakes. Sansa broke the silence. Do you trust her, Jon? Truly? He turned, meeting her gaze. As much as one can trust any ruler with dragons. She showed me compassion, Sansa. She listened. She agreed to give the North its freedom, at least in name. That's more than any Southern king has ever done. She nodded slowly. I just worry about the day she sits on the throne. Power changes people. But if you truly believe in this alliance, I'll support you. I only wish we didn't have to send more men to war. They've fought enough. Jon's eyes flicked down, guilt heavy in his chest. I know. But hopefully this will be the last war we have to fight. Rising, Sansa came to him and placed a hand on his arm. Just come back. You and your men. We need you here in the North, not in some southern battlefield grave. He covered her hand with his own. I promise I'll do everything I can. She studied him, then her lips curved in a faint, sad smile. You've changed, Jon. More than I ever imagined. You speak like a king, even if you deny the title. And that dragon, it suits you. He swallowed, looking out at Drogon's dark silhouette. It doesn't feel real sometimes. But perhaps it's the gods' plan. The White Walkers were beyond anything we knew, yet we overcame them. This is just the next step. She squeezed his arm in silent acknowledgement, then slipped away to retire. Jon remained by the window, gaze lost in the gentle snowfall. The hush of night enveloped him, and Ghost came to his side, nuzzling his palm. He patted the direwolf's head. For a moment, memory flashed of that first day he'd found Drogon in the wilderness. If he had walked away, if he had left the beast to die, everything would be different now. That single choice had led to forging an alliance that might reshape the realm. He wondered if the old gods watched from their silent weirwoods, weaving mortal fates. If so, he hoped they approved of the path he'd chosen. With a weary sigh, he turned from the window and headed to his chamber. Tomorrow, the mustering of volunteers would begin. Letters would fly across the North. The final confrontation with Cersei drew nearer, and Daenerys Targaryen, his aunt and ally, would march for the Iron Throne. As he settled into the bed, Ghost at his feet, he let his eyes drift shut, body heavy with exhaustion. Distantly, he thought of Daenerys standing on that balcony in Dragonstone, her voice soft, asking if he felt the call of their shared legacy. He couldn't deny a flicker of that call within him. But the North came first. Always. Even if he felt the fire of dragons in his blood, the ice of the North had shaped his heart. He would walk that line for as long as he breathed. Sleep tugged at him, and he finally surrendered to its pull. The night was calm, the snow gentle, and in the courtyard, a dragon slept beside a direwolf's paw prints. In the hush of that winter dream, the seeds of a new era took root, an era shaped by a Stark who was also a Targaryen and a queen who had lost one child only to have him returned in a stranger's hands. Whatever storms lay on the horizon, they would face them together, forging a path through the chaos. And for the first time in years, Jon Snow felt the faint, undeniable warmth of hope.